Hey, Cathy. So, welcome to this conversation around the Racial Imaginary Institute. My name is LeRonn Brooks, but I'll let everyone introduce themselves from left to right.
Hi, I'm Monica Youn. I'm a poet mostly. I used to be a lawyer.
Hi, I'm Simon. I'm a writer and curator and also program coordinator for TRI.
LeRonn Brooks, poet, curator.
Hi, I'm Cathy. I'm a poet and essayist.
I'm Sara'o. I don't know if this is working. I'm Sara'o Bery. I work in film. I have a job at a film studio called A24, and I also curate with the Racial Imaginary Institute.
Hi, I'm Jess Rao. I'm a novelist and essayist.
So around 2016? 17. Claudia Rankin, of course Claudia Rankin, I think everyone here would know who she is, decided to form a curatorial team around what was going on in the world as a way to address the situation that's going on in the world, the rise of white supremacy, but also the momentum of the kinds of things, the anti-blackness and, the anti-BIPOC situation that was sort of going on. It was a momentum happening, and, Claudia was very interested in this idea of the racial imaginary. Right, that place where the imaginations of, let's just say, the imagination in that time of white supremacists was actually taking center stage and culminating in, 2016, the election of Donald Trump. And so, for Claudia, the question was, how can we form a curatorial group mixed of many different kinds of creatives, cultural workers, to actually address the situation? And so, how can poets, writers, performers sort of get together, and so artists speaking about or using this platform to speak about or to speak against what was happening in the world. And so, Claudia sort of brought us together in sort of different parts, but, together we formed this group, and through all these conversations and meeting, and we started to make things. We started to form together, use our resources to make things. Now, we're not an institution. This is not MoMA, but Claudia is our MoMA. She's our Whitney, she's our institution. And she decided to use her influence and her name to make a difference and to give us a platform to speak about what was happening in the world. And so the Racial Imaginary Institute started working in 2016-17, started working on this first exhibition called On Whiteness. And we gathered together, began meeting in Claudia's home, then in Chelsea, to sort of begin the conversation around what would that look like? What does it mean to have artists and cultural workers use their talent to form a curatorial voice through which other artists can have a platform to speak to that particular moment? Now, we've moved on to another theme and another symposium and exhibition that we're going to speak about as well. But, I'm going to first ask my colleagues here, and we begin with you, Jess, from right to left, right? What was happening in the world in 2016, or maybe beyond, that you felt, that you sensed, what was happening in the world for you that you maybe felt this sense of white supremacy rising, or, what kind of concerns were you having around the time that the Racial Imaginary was formed?
Well, I think we all remember quite well everything that was going on in the world in 2016 in particular, but having followed Claudia's work through the previous decade, and also seeing sort of larger trends in the literary community, I think what the Racial Imaginary Institute was tapping into was this sense that there was a atmosphere, a feeling of a state of heightened fear and a state of heightened animosity that I sometimes describe as like sort of an ongoing racial emergency, which is not to say that the United States hasn't been in a state of perpetual racial emergency, but one of the sort of historical currents of the post-civil rights era was that race would sort of flare into the headlines and then disappear, if you think about something like the LA riots in the early 1990s. And in the 2010s, with the murder, with the events in Ferguson in 2014, and even before that with the murder of Trayvon Martin, there was this sense that a condition of racial emergency and racial alarm came into the headlines and stayed with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the sort of beginnings of what felt like a new era of civil rights activism and the immediate and very dramatic blowback against that. There was really, I think, a feeling, by the time you got to the mid-2010s, there was a feeling of, a real state of internal conflict, civil conflict in the country. And I think that was the historical moment where the Racial Imaginary Institute emerged.
Hi. Yeah. It's interesting because I actually, I came to the Racial Imaginary Institute sort of through an invite from Claudia that sprung from the fact that I was working at a studio and I was working on a film called Moonlight, and Moonlight, had the experience that it did sort of in the public eye. And I think actually, for me, the experience of 2017 was not totally dissimilar to the moment that we're in now. There actually was a lot of conversation around race, and people were opening up spaces in the same way that they are now to have the conversations, and for lack of a better word, I felt like it was in vogue, right? And what was exciting to me about the Racial Imaginary Institute was that, well, one, it felt really casual when we started. It was super, super casual. I don't want to make it sound like there was like this teleology of like, we were going to make this great institution. Like,
there was
no.
cheese.
There was a little bit of cheese.
sushi.
There was like one thing of sushi, and it was like we were sitting around a living room and just trying to figure out what even this prompt meant and like what we were going to do with it. And I think what was exciting about it was that it was like a wide open blank canvas for without really any parameters, and we were kind of just making it up as we went along. So that first show and discussing what the theme of that first show would be, which was a show on whiteness, grew really organically out of conversations we were having, just 8 people in a room, kind of like, I was hungover, I don't know about other people, like on a Sunday morning in Claudia's apartment, and at a time where I felt like these conversations actually were happening in a lot of different spaces, but maybe this one felt a little bit more creative and a little bit more charged just because of the cool, interesting people involved. So yeah.
Hello? Is this on? Okay. I think this is on. I think, Racial Imaginary, actually, even before that it was a group, I believe Claudia Rankin conceived it as an anthology, first of all. And so, it was first a website based on this talk that she gave at this literary conference where she basically called out a white poet. I'm not going to go into detail of it, but then and then on the website was just an invitation for other people to write in about, institutional racist examples that they encountered. And in this anthology, Claudia Rankin said that the way Americans treat racism is more like it's a scandal, rather than systemic injustice that's ongoing. And I would say this kind of awakening was happening probably further back than 2016, 2017. I would say it was, probably with Ferguson on that, just America, the mainstream America started waking up to it. And that I think white Americans started to become much more self-conscious of whiteness. And it was, so that's where I think it really started to kind of come alive. And Claudia's book, Citizen, was also, was part of that wave. So when we got together, it was super casual. We just hung out and talked and argued and debated. But I have to say, the Racial Imaginary was, I thought of it as a kind of intervention, because there were just like a lot of, what it ended up being was that it was more about kind of collaborating with institutional spaces to kind of, it's a kind of reckoning, right? Like what are making the institution like the Whitney or the kitchen or what have you aware of its kind of history of whiteness and how and where it could go from there. Whether it's been, it's that in and of itself is always, of course, difficult to do because, to quote Andrea Fraser, or, what Andrea Fraser said, that, the institutions tend to eat the avant-garde, they tend to eat whatever form of resistance that's questioning it, but that was part of our process.
In 2016, I was teaching Africana Studies at Lehman College in the Bronx. And increasingly, my students were commenting on her because, they were working in, they would work at, places in which they come into contact with white people, and they were complaining like it was becoming more hostile for some particular reason, right? Their encounters with white people were becoming more contentious. Right? And as an Africana Studies professor, my syllabus begins with the Middle Passage, and it goes through a lot of trauma. It goes through Trayvon Martin, it goes through enslavement, it goes through many of the situations by which I wanted to help them understand and give them a resource by which to go into the world understanding what was happening. And so as a professor, for me, it was very important to hear out my students and to sort of, because it wasn't just in education, it was also listening to them and a lot of listening and taking on to myself what they were saying, but also how could I use my teaching as a way to help them understand that they're not alone in the world and that the hostilities that were going on, they can survive, but it was a really kind of problematic moment because, the judicial system was increasingly making it aware that there was no safety, right? My students looked like Trayvon Martin, my students looked like Mike Brown, my students looked like Breonna Taylor, and they saw themselves in those young people who were murdered. And so for me, it was a moment of joining a group and participating in a group and, okay, so how then can we sort of address this moment in ways that are meaningful? And intervention is a good way to put that, like, how can we intervene in not just the situations, but in some particular way, offset the consequences of what was happening to black bodies. And we all were feeling that at that particular moment.
Yeah, in 2016, I came to this as the youngest member and just a humble listener. I was an undergrad at Princeton and had not yet read Claudia's book, but had actually seen the website first, and the kind of cogent articulation of this relation between the concept of a racial imaginary and how race being an imaginary thing that nonetheless has sort of material consequences for life, and if race being something of the imagination, what do workers of the imagination have in terms of an intervention? And I was studying art, and also I was interning at the Whitney when the sort of Dana Schutz controversy happened, and was sort of ensconced in what felt kind of like the most recent, I guess, crisis in institutions amongst multiple over many, many years. And it felt that the racial imaginary, in addition to being a kind of amazing space to just kind of absorb and listen to these conversations, but also an opportunity to think about the relation between sort of cultural institutions and race and sort of material circumstances in a really exciting new way. And so that's kind of what brought me there.
So in 2016, I remember, I always think of this moment like the moment in Terminator where Skynet becomes self-conscious, like there's always been this all-powerful thing that's out there, but once it becomes aware of its own power and how much of that it controls, that was sort of what it reminded me of. I mean, not so much institutional whiteness, which had always been aware of its own power, but maybe individual whiteness. I was taking a flight to St. Louis the day after the 2016 election. And I remember being conscious of the race of everyone on that flight. A lot of the white guys were like actively smirking at me as a woman of color, just, you know, giving this kind of, yeah, you're gonna get yours look that I had seen so many times in the intervening time. You know, and I was like, all of them are newly aware of their race in a way that they had sort of taken for granted before, and what will happen here. And, you know, so much of what's been said here is funny and brings up so many memories. I mean, I do want to stress that we didn't agree on everything when we first came together, and there were a lot of discussions about, like, are we going to include our own work in the racial imaginary, or are we just going to showcase other people's work? And it ended up being the latter. Are we going to try to push for a physical space, or are we going to be this free-floating entity that intervenes in existing institutions? And that conversation is ongoing, but it has pretty much remained the latter. And Simon's bringing up the Dana Schutz controversy reminded me that I think one of the early things that we did was we were invited to the Whitney to respond to the Dana Schutz controversy, and that event, like, it was before we had gotten our act together, and that event just felt weird and kind of wrong, and like we were brought in to provide like damage control and cover for an institution that really had no agenda for change, and we're like, okay, this doesn't feel right. How can we do this better? To the extent that we're invited into institutions, how can we be a force to change that institution rather than a force to, you know, reinforce the existing structures of that institution? And, you know, can we not just be like a scandal quick fix? I can't remember if, oh yeah, and you know, the imaginary part I think was interesting because the salience on race was turned up for everybody. And what I really did like about, for example, and this is jumping forward in time, but to the On Whiteness show, is we were told by the folks at the kitchen that they had never seen A, so large a crowd for an art show, and B, so varied a crowd for an art show. Like a lot of people who were not like art world usual suspects, because there was this real hunger for, you know, given that this reality is happening, that, you know, Claudia had this phrase, the volume on whiteness has been turned up, that this deafening, like, noise of white supremacy is surrounding us at all times. We need a way to talk about that. We need a vocabulary, we need tools, and there was this real hunger among people to like find these tools, to discover, including a lot of people who had never taken their race as particularly salient before, so.
Yeah, one of the important things about the racial imaginary is that it's egalitarian, that no one is the leader, that we all have an equal say in participation in the kinds of things that we do. And so everyone here has multiple sort of talents, and so how can we actually be dynamic, right? How can we see our talents and what we do in terms of writers and, you know, surround video, and how can we use that as a way to sort of address the situation creatively? And so, on top of partnering with institutions, right? So we had the Brooklyn Museum, we had the Whitney, and you know, these major institutions that did not have an historical tradition. They did not have a tradition of diversity in terms of the hiring practice. And the hiring practice influenced the kinds of exhibitions, the kinds of programs that maybe could not address the moment that we were in, that only got worse, right? And so there's a way in which our participation, our collaboration with these institutions, we really needed to do what we were there to do and not to sort of partner as some kind of, you know, Band-Aid or anything like that. And so, you know, what we asked for them to do is what we asked for them to do is actually do something that your institution cannot do and historically never had an interest necessarily in doing and may not have the structure to do that. And so we have a film series, we have a physical exhibition, we had a symposium, and we had all kinds of projects around the city because it was an overwhelming moment. And to their credit, you know, they gave us space, but, you know, our question was not, okay, you're just allowing us space, but we want to make significant change to actually address the moment. And Monica, you mentioned the crowd came out to the kitchen because it felt for them like there wasn't enough conversation, especially in the arts, around what the hell was happening.
I also wanted to revisit some of the questions that came up when we were doing the exhibit, because I think this centering an exhibit around whiteness did raise a lot of questions. One of them being, like, one idea was to actually even include Dana Schutz in the show. And
Yeah, that was a fight.
which was a big debate, because we felt that we did not want the exhibit to somehow, what's the word, repair or be sort of
Penance.
Huh?
Penance.
Yes. We didn't want it to be an example of a show for Dana Schutz to show penance, and we knew that she would completely capsize the show and everyone would just talk about her. But it was, there were other questions like, how many white artists should we have there? Should we include artworks by white artists who are not, or white artworks that are, that have been made before this time period that haven't self-consciously been about whiteness? Because, you could have any work by a white artist from mid-century before, from wherever, and put it in this show. And then, there was also the question of, there were also artists of color who were also kind of bristling at the subject matter too, and thinking, well, we don't want to make a work where we're just reacting against whiteness. We want to, and it was really important for us to emphasize that it's more about them sort of reimagining what these institutional spaces could be. And I think what Racial Imaginary has been, as well as a lot of these other nonprofit organizations and so forth, has been sort of they're all part of trying to change the American narrative, by making whiteness visible is to change the national consciousness.
I felt I wanted to return to what both Cathy and Monica were saying about the nature of the collaboration of these organizations was very heterogeneous, where something that stuck with me that Monica said, I remember, is that
Simon organizes everything. This guy is our go-to. He's the center.
My main contribution to the Racial Imaginary has been bringing in Simon.
But the kind of idea that this is not the kind of people of color pony show for these different organizations. It was through the nature of the collaboration, it was trying to push ourselves to create spaces that were dangerous to existing racial hierarchies, not sort of amenable to normal sort of diversity kind of conversations. And just like a concrete example that came of that was working with, so what we often do is we'll issue invitations to different organizations, and this specifically was around whiteness. And the text that we were using was by this queer feminist philosopher, Sara R, and the text is Phenomenology of Whiteness. It's pretty accessible online. And one of the key questions is, if whiteness gains currency by going unnoticed, what does it mean to mark or notice whiteness? And so it was important that we were working with institutions that they were doing both internal as well as external kind of excavation of this concept of whiteness. And one of the most revealing anecdotes was working with an institution and then, kind of letting them go on their own, and then eventually seeing that the program that they did was very much centered around marking blackness. And it was so revealing to me in the sense that kind of existing institutional models are so easy to kind of impose an I onto an other, but it's so difficult for them to look inwards that it was the default to blackness. And like having this conversation with them afterwards, I was like, this is wrong. Like, you guys did this wrong. And them being like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean? And that was just very revealing, I think.
Yeah. I would just say, like, an example of where I think this went well was actually, we did a film series with BAM, with Ashley Clark, who, smartest man in New York City. I think he lives in Jersey, but he lives. but Ashley was over at BAM at the time. He's now at the Criterion, and he and I worked together on this series, and we sort of screened something like 30 films over a couple weeks. And they were films, I put down a list because I wouldn't remember them offhand, but it's like Sofia Coppola's Virgin Suicides and Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Rocky. And
White Chicks.
Yeah, White Chicks. Godfather Part 2, Claire Denis' White Material, Taxi Driver, yeah, Pulp Fiction, Get Out. But all sort of couched within a conversation about whiteness. So really looking at Ferris Bueller as a film about white manhood and masculinity run amok, and then also having these films introduced by speakers, by authors, by screenwriters. To give it that context. And it was a way that folks hadn't really seen these films. These are all films we know. We've all seen them 100 times, and even for me, it was seeing them anew when given this context. So that I think is like a good example of how we hope to work with institutions.
And to have a sold-out screening of Ferris Bueller's Day Off in 2017.
Or white chicks on 35 millimeter, yeah.
And we also asked a lot of the artists who participated. One such artist, Vijay Iyer, here, who curated a performance series, but also had a player piano, which he had myself and other young black men speak about our first encounters, or with the police and things like that, right? And so we also asked the artists who participated to actually do something new, do something unique, and so there are different layers to this, because an artist acting an artist is something that is very personal. Not to say that pure curator is not personal, but there's more of a personal implication because this is your craft and this is your kindred to a certain degree, right? So on that particular level, there's always a cost. At that particular level, there's always an indictment if in fact you're not providing a situation by which they are protected.
I think for me, one of the most gratifying aspects is that we were able to fund 2-week residencies during the run of the show at the Kitchen. So we had artists in residence. I know that Vijay was one of them, Angie Pittman, Marguerite Hemmings, Jackie Siblis-Drury, the Dark Noise Collective. I'm sure and Sungmin Lee. And they were able, sorry, Sungmin Kim? Sungmin Lee. Good, I had it right the first time. I was like, I didn't get that wrong, did I? And the show was hung upstairs, so they were able to go up and interact with the show, and then come downstairs and think about responsive work, and that was really, I thought, wonderful.
Yeah. So one of the things that we want to do is not just we're moving forward, in terms of the project on nationalism and belonging. Jess, you want to speak about that?
Yeah. So this is a new symposium on nationalism. What's the current title on nationalism?
On nationalism, the fragility and possibility of we.
The fragility
I tend to edit it slightly when I'm sending out emails.
On nationalism, the fragility and the possibility of we. So we're, in a sense, what we're doing is we're expanding the vision of TRI to talk about ideas of communalism and ideas of group belonging and ideas of racialization, not just in the United States, but across borders. And of course, what we really want to focus on is the many roles that nationalism plays in the world today, from illiberal nationalism, the nationalism of Putin, the nationalism of Narendra Modi, to, on the other side, the role of nationalism in indigenous rights movements, the concepts of sovereignty in the global South, decolonization, etc. So we're working on a very large program, and I'm not sure whether that's coming from me or I have no idea. Just the ambience of the room. The ghosts in the room are trying to intervene here because we're talking about nationalism with George looking down. So originally this was planned for 2020. It was planned for the spring of 2020, and of course it was knocked away by COVID. And so COVID and the pandemic is part of what we're going to be talking about, obviously, because vaccine nationalism and the national competitiveness in the response to the virus has just reiterated and reasserted the absurdity of nationalism as an organizing system in the face of a virus that doesn't adhere to boundaries.
Yeah. And also, what does it mean to still be in the shadow of Trump? Right?
So our symposium, for those of you who are interested, is currently scheduled for June 11th, and we are still nailing down a large venue, but we have prospects for large venues, so it will happen. And I think speakers so far include Viet Thanh Nguyen, Ura, Youn, Noel, hopefully, well, let me think, who else? Hopefully Pankaj Mishra, John Keane, let me think, Josefina Baez. Who else? Layli Long Soldier, Banu Kapil. I think it's gonna be a lot of fun. And we're also planning on a separate day of performance and a group relations workshop at St. Mark's Poetry Project. Or at St. Mark's in the Bowery, actually. So it's going to be interesting. So please sign up for our mailing list if you're interested, because the tickets for the Kitchen Symposium were gone within 10 minutes.
Monica, would you want to speak about the Kitchen Symposium?
Oh, the Kitchen Symposium. Yeah, the Kitchen Symposium was a lot of fun. We wanted to get together a group of speakers, I think both younger and older, more established and less established speakers, to talk about this question of whiteness. And it was particularly important to us to get, I think, a variety of disciplinary perspectives. So our keynotes were Nell Painter, the historian, Linda Martinoff, the philosopher, and Patricia Williams, the critical legal theorist. And then we also had people like, Saidiya Hartman, like Lauren Berlant, VJ, it was really huge. We had the audience, as I said, the tickets were hotly contested, and we also live streamed it before a large audience. And the whole thing is now online. We also had a series of talkbacks for people like Saidiya Hartman, whose presentations had generated a lot of audience interest, but there hadn't been sufficient time for Q&A, so she, came and was willing to do like an hour-long talkback. So we staged those as a separate. Sadhana Bery, we staged those as a series of separate events, and it again. Just spoke to the hunger that people had for, like, how do we talk about this and what can we do? What can we, as people who are not politicians, as people who are not, for the most part, armed, what do we do about this?
Yeah, considering that so much of the cultural conversation was actually shaping the right imaginary toward what it meant to be American, the idea that, we can sort of enter that space or create a new space and give a platform for artists and intellectuals and thinkers to actually form not a consensus, but form a sort of to form something that hadn't been formed before, which is the best art. So I think we should take any questions in the time we have left. We have a few minutes left. Yeah.
You mentioned being in this room, and I think a lot of people around us are questioning the fact that we can create new narratives or challenge existing narratives, right? But just the fact that we're sitting in these spaces is obviously complicated. And how do we manage these dynamics of interacting with these, dynamics of power, mostly financial, I guess, but also political.
Yeah, I mean, it is true. It is true. I mean, navigating the extreme wealth of the art world and, being cultural workers who aren't, benefiting from much of the finances or anything like that. And so we're in a real vulnerable position. I mean, that's the truth. But then, right? What is our responsibility? Doesn't leave us voiceless. It leaves us, close to consequences, but that doesn't mean you should forfeit the idea of what you want this place to be. Right? We pay one way or the other. One way or the other,
I think it's a complicated question that artists, curators, collectors, well, mostly artists who are constantly grappling with, right? What does it mean to make art, if you're an artist of color, queer artist, female artist, what does it mean to make an artwork for these institutions that are paid for by Sackler? Or, the art world is basically, it's ethical laundering, right? Like where billionaires launder their ethics through supporting a very morally sound group show. And that's, something that all artists and writers think about constantly. And I think there have been organizations like Decolonize This, for instance, that have protested these institutional spaces. And for us, we were having, I haven't really been an active participant of the racial imaginary this year, but last year, this was a discussion that came up, which is that we can't just do these collaborations with these historic white spaces. What would it mean if we were to do it do these talks in community spaces, or in public spaces or nonprofit spaces? What would it look like if we collaborated with people who were completely outside of these artistic bubbles?
And I also think that it's important, I think most of us are to a point where we have some one of these institutions backing us in some way, but to not allow ourselves to be encompassed by this institution. Like Claudia, at the time she started the Racial Imaginary, was at USC and then at Yale and NYU. Now, USC and Yale and NYU would all have loved to host the Racial Imaginary. They would love to host us physically. They would love to take credit for us. We don't want that. We want to maintain our independence. And you see this model like in the poetry world, which is, my home base. You see institutions like Cave Canem and Kundiman and Canto Mundo, which started as kind of just, support networks and have become their own powerhouses. And so, for artists of color to create and maintain our own institutions, whether or not we're the richest institutions on the block is not really important as long as we maintain our allegiance to these institutions.
Yeah, sometimes thinking of it as like institutional critique, often you'll end up kind of wedding yourself to the object of your critique in like a weird, unhappy marriage. And I've found the work of the Racial Imaginary to be something like institutional agnosticism or indifference, is kind of like finding critique by other means.
It's interesting that basically there's a
Yeah, Ibram was actually scheduled to speak at our first symposium, and then, as many of you know, he had, very severe personal health issues that prevented him from attending.
It's a very complicated question. It's difficult to answer in a short time, but I think what we're seeing right now is a sort of two-pronged, very profound backlash against the racial awakenings of the last decade. And one part of that backlash is, of course, white nationalism and the white power movement in its institutional form in the Republican Party. But the other part of it, I think, is that the recoil of many institutions, as you described, who had this, or who had many members in those institutions having a kind of racial awakening in a sense of we need to change, we need to do better, and now there's this institutional recoil in a sense of we're going to resist that change, we're going to push out that change, or we're going to domesticate it and make it serve our own purposes, and nothing really is going to change. And you're seeing that now in many universities, you're seeing it in Google, you're seeing it all over the place. And so, what the goal of the Racial Imaginary Institute is to keep looking at and keep raising questions about what's happening right now, and what's happening right now is backlash. Is the resistance to the resistance, is the counter, the counter-reformation, or whatever you want to call it. And so we need to either, this is when our work is particularly vital, because the institutional winds and the cultural winds are now pushing against us.
It's
I would say.
a good example, if we're talking about Ibram Kendi, is like the critical race theory backlash that's happening now. So within sort of these coastal spaces, like in New York and so forth, it seems like we're kind of preaching to the choir or what have you, but it's like writers like Ibram Kendi or Nicole Hannah-Jones or, any of these public intellectuals have like a raised profile that's big enough that it's reaching, that their books are being taught all over America, and there is a real kind of, I hate to use this word, polarized backlash, so it's interesting. This is an example of this dialogue exceeding or expanding beyond the Whitney Museum or or some progressive high school in New York to other parts of America, and this is what we're experiencing right now.
I was just gonna just to piggyback on that. There's also there's an element of the Racial Imaginary Institute that is not coastal, right? That we work with like David Kordansky in LA, we've worked with the Whitney here, we work with it, but we also work with institutions across the country and also internationally, particularly as we start this new show on nationalism. The way that, something beautiful about COVID was that, something yuck. Something revelatory was that we were able to meet on Zoom, and that meant we were able to add members who lived in South Africa, who lived in Italy, who lived in the UK, and work really closely with them in a way that we weren't able to before. And so, it's we've already curated shows with those members. We're doing more. We've been invited to institutions like the Sydney Opera House, where so there is also that element as well that I think is important to sort of keep front of mind.
And it's also empowering smaller arts organizations. That's also important to the project. And so the thing is not just being sponsored or collaborating with these major institutions or wealthy institutions, but then, right, how can we actually help institutions that are actually struggling right now because of COVID, right, in that revelatory moment, right? And so it's not just, that kind of one-to-one, but it's also how can we actually bring up institutions that actually have a very significant voice. And I think so thank you, everybody. And
thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Okay. Thank you, Christine, for being here. So it is a great honor to be here today as part of this groundbreaking event and gathering. I'm a big fan of Carrie Mae Weems, and I have got to know her work through Park Avenue Armory. I'm here today because I'm an artist in residency here, and the work that I'll be talking about, although it was premiered before I became a resident here, it was developed and worked on and even presented at my studio before the pandemic in 2019. So my name is Sara Serpa. I'm a Portuguese vocalist and composer, improviser. I've been living in New York for 13 years, and I've been in the States for 16. So I moved here to study music, and I've been working in various genres. And besides this work as a musician and creator, I'm also involved in initiatives related to gender equity and gender justice in music, such as We Have Voice Collective and most recent, the Mutual Mentorship for Musicians. As a citizen of the world and as someone who thinks deeply about my heritage as a Portuguese artist living in America, I have been involved in research on colonialism, and I created a work around that, Portuguese colonialism. And I see the work that I'm presenting here today as a continuation of this work. So I'll be talking and sharing clips and videos and music, because music is what I do, from my most recent album, Intimate Strangers, a collaboration with Nigerian writer Emmanuel Iduma. And this collaboration is mostly, how I see it is mostly about movement of people in the world, forced movement, voluntary movement, and movement that is criminalized. And not only that, but encounters, and how do we see the other, and how we are affected by these encounters. So the work is called Intimate Strangers, and what I'll show now is how our performance usually starts when people are still sitting, and we put on this clip. Okay, so moving on. I'll just speak briefly about Emmanuel and how I encountered him. Emmanuel is the author of A Stranger's Pose, a travel memoir, and A Stranger's Pose is the book that I was inspired by to create Intimate Strangers. His essays on art criticism have been published in Granta, the New York Review of Books, Aperture, #1, Best American Travel Writing 2020, Art Forum, and Art in America. He has received numerous awards, and his most recent work, I'm Still With You, is a memoir on the aftermath of the Nigerian Civil War, and will come out next year or in 2 years, published by Algonquin and William Collins. So I'll do a little bit of reading, and then you'll hear Emmanuel's voice, and then I'll just share parts of the music and of the work we created together. So I came across Emmanuel's work through his Instagram posts on archive and memory. At the time, I was researching my own family's archive to create recognition, which focused on Portuguese colonialism, and reached out to Emmanuel for his insight on the work I was embarking on. We met, talked, found common interests, and wondered about collaborating together. The opportunity came sooner than expected. I was commissioned by John Zorn to create a new piece to be presented at the National Sawdust, and immediately thought about Emmanuel's new book, A Stranger's Pose, a beautiful travelogue describing Emmanuel's journey and encounters through and in different African countries. It was exciting to create a performance piece that involved visuals. We used Emmanuel's book's photos, experimenting with the senses, sight and hearing. From the beginning, we decided Emmanuel would read his own writings. His voice is crucial in this piece, narrating in English, a global language that belongs to many places, highlighting the act of listening to understand and to connect to the distant reality described during the album. Each chapter of this book is enchanting and moving, and as time passes by, Emmanuel's words gain new meaning and depth. While Emmanuel in this piece represents himself, the singing voices, which is me, Sophia Ray, and Aubrey Johnson, we are simultaneously narrators, storytellers, and spirits that travel along, opening several emotional doors through the piece. Kazim Nakvi's and Matt Mitchell's both perform as well, modular synth and piano, and their powerful contributions shape the landscapes beautifully. Throughout the collaboration process, we were both stricken by grief. Within a few months apart, we both lost our beloved fathers. Mine passed 3 days after we premiered Intimate Strangers. This music and project will be forever associated with the before and after loss. Profound grief, as I never experienced before, brought me closer to some of the stories Emmanuel writes about. While Intimate Strangers starts with Emmanuel's journey, it quickly becomes all travelers, migrants, and displaced people's journeys. A journey of loss, uncertainty, fight for dignity, and connections between those who leave and those who stay. Like echoes from a distant reality, Intimate Strangers aims to reflect on how we see the other and how we describe hospitality and humanity for future generations. Thank you for listening. Now we will listen to Emmanuel, who recorded this. Wait. No.
My collaborative performance with Sara'o brought me closer to understanding how words worked in a pre-literate time, when writing was yet to be invented, when stories were passed from mouth to mouth, from memory to memory. Sarah's composition distills A Stranger's Pose to its essential groove and vital ballad. During our performances of Intimate Strangers, her singing, backed by Aubrey Johnson's and Sophia Ray's, have always seemed to me as a process of mapping the deeper emotional logic of my travel stories. And when combined with the music of Kazim Nakvi's modular synth and Matt Mitchell's piano, the soundscape opens like a field in which known and strange things slowly pass. For instance, throughout the process of recording this project, it became clearer to me how the deaths in the desert described to me in Bamako might be mourned, or how those who sing know it is not too lofty to ascribe a melody to the sea. I express gratitude to Sara for her magnificent parsing of my words into music. Our collaboration was bookended by a time of personal mourning for me, and in more ways than one, the music saw me through. Grateful thanks, as always, to Armory, my love.
So the way we organized this performance was Emmanuel, we would start with Emmanuel in Nigeria. Basically, his book is about his travels from Nigeria, Lagos to Sarajevo through land. And so he crossed different countries, different African countries. And so it starts in Nigeria, and through his travels, suddenly he encounters these natural borders, which are the desert and the ocean. The first one that we approach is water, and here is the first song, How Do You Know Where to Go?
There is a little boy who has grown up close to water. He is on a boat in the middle of a lake. He sees neither east nor west, only water. He has never learned how it is possible to see pathways on a sheet of water.
So after the water, we encounter the desert. Quite.
In Bamako, he is known by name, which he tells me with no hesitation. But his actual name, Gabriel, he tells me in a whisper, in confidence. When I tell him our mission, overland from Lagos to Sarajevo, along the coast, he says he is happy that we aren't traveling through the desert. There are many burial places in the desert, he begins to aver. We find stones in the desert. We remove the stones. We see a decaying corpse. The name on the document remains legible. This is how we recognize the person. In the desert, death means nothing.
So throughout the piece, there's a profound sense of loss and grief. And I think like both me and Emmanuel found a way to express this mourning for all the deaths that happened, that he heard of and that we know of, in particular between the African country and Europe, African continent and Europe. The piece evolves. I'm not going to show all the parts of the piece, but there are many different encounters with different people. But at the end, there's a moment where there's a moment of reflection, and this happens during the night, where Emmanuel is the traveler, he's the other, and he has absorbed all the stories that he heard. This is another video called Night. This video. The previous video that you saw was created by the Mexican videographer Mariana Meraz. This one was made by me.
When night covered me in a prayer blanket, I interceded for our recumbent figures and watched the interminable horizon of lost love. When night covered me in a prayer blanket, I interceded for our recumbent figures and watched the interminable horizon of lost love. I know you twice, first as a jour, distant beauty. Second has a marigold, listening body. They say those who live die slowly. I say I dream much morning. I dream you living. 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 I dream you living.
In Sintian, I spend a considerable amount of time observing trees. They are dense in the distance, sparse as I approach. Only when I am close enough do I notice their singularities. And yet, because I do not recognize any of them, they remain anonymous to me. In the city where you and I lived, there were hardly any trees to serve as metaphor. Only now I am aware. Do I realize that for you, I must become a tree? every tree is the opposite of wandering.
And finally, I'll show you the last moment of the piece. This is a video by Angolan film director called Fradik, and it's for this song called "For You I Must Become a Tree" that kind of became the motum for this album. I'll be quick, and then if you have any questions, you can do so after the video. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. We created the piece in 2018, so this was premiered in 2018, and then 2019 we performed in different places, and I think he moved back to Nigeria beginning of 2020, before the pandemic. Yeah. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day here, and stay for Christine. Thank you.
From us this week. This is the Greg Tate syllabus. Pieces by Greg Tate dating back 40 years. Harlem When It Sizzled, 1982. Talking Heads, Grooves from the Heart of Darkness, 1983. Stagger Lee versus the Proper Negro, Eddie Murphy, Wynton Marsalis, and Prince, 1984. Toure Kunda, 1985. Black Rock Coalition Manifesto, 1985. Yo Hermeneutics, Hip-Hopping Toward Post-Structuralism, 1985. Just tell me when you're ready. Oh. Cult Nats Meet Freaky Deek, 1986. Greg Tate, The Writings and Music of Greg Tate. Black Metropolis, Upholding Sugar Hill's Radical Tradition, 1987. I'm White, What's Wrong with Michael Jackson, 1987. Public Enemy, Homies on the Range, 1988. Public Enemy, The Devil Made 'Em Do It, 1988. 1987, Black Metropolis, Race, Clash, and Culture, Rebirth of a Nation, 1988. Beyond Outrage, 1988. Hip Hop Nation, It's Like That, Y'all, 1988. Langston Hughes, A Genius Child Comes of Age, 1988. Greg Tate. Black Ontology Now, Dark Matters, and Meeting the Lady Gaga Challenge, 2011. Top 10 Reasons Why So Few Black Folk Appeared Down to Occupy Wall Street, 2017. Say It Loud, Tracing a Populist History of the Black Avant-Garde from James Brown to Kamasi Washington and hashtag Black Lives Matter, 2017. The Sex Lives of Famous Black People, 2012. To Pimp a Butterfly, 2015. The Freedom Principle, Experiments in Art and Music, 1965 to now, 2015. Miles Davis at Newport, 1955 to 1975, The Bootleg Series, Volume 4, 2015. How Black Lives Matter Changed Hip Hop and R&B, 2015. On Mike Todd's Hustlers Convention, 2015. On a Biography of Henry Grimes, 2016. Flyboy 2, The Greg Tate Reader, 2016. Prince, A Eulogy, 2016. Everything's Beautiful, 2016. Chuck Berry, The Double Helix of Rock and Roll, 2017. LA, 1992. How Race Riots Have Shaped America, 2017. 444 is Not an Apology, 2017. All right. Christine Jones. Woohoo!
I know everybody in this room almost. Hi.
Do you want a mic?
Christine. I don't think I need a mic, right? So today I'm here to talk about Theater for One, which is a project that I've been working on for about 20 years now. And Theater for One began, I should say first of all, Theater for One is a performance space for one actor and one audience member. It's private, it's portable, and we perform in public spaces in New York, around the country, and now around the world. And it began when I was at a wedding, and there was a magician performing at the wedding. And at the end of the ceremony, he came around and he was doing magic for people one-on-one. And I don't know if you've ever experienced magic one-on-one, but it is one of the most ecstatic experiences. To experience something privately that we're used to experiencing publicly is completely intoxicating. So I became curious about how we could create this kind of intoxicating atmosphere for a theatrical production. And I realized that there is a precedent for these one-on-one interactions, namely in peep show booths and confessionals. And I toured the city. I met Danny XXX, who makes all the peep shows in Manhattan. And I went to confessionals and studied what that relationship is. And then I had the good fortune of knowing Ada Tola with Low Tech Architects, and I went to them and asked them to build a theater for me. I'm a set designer in many aspects of my life, but I really felt like this was a building and that I needed to involve architects. And they had the brilliant idea of repurposing roadbox technology to make our theater. Theaters are often called black boxes, and here we really took that idea and created a black box for theater. It's using the chrome detailing, the wheels, the handles, everything that you might see in a typical road case for music equipment or sound equipment. On one side is the audience member, on the other side is the actor. In between them, when the actor gets ready to perform, there is a slider. So when the audience member comes in, they don't know what they're going to see, they don't know who they're going to see, there's an aspect of serendipity. When the performance begins, the slider opens to reveal the performer on the other side. So on one side, there's a door for the performer, and as you can see, when the audience enters, the inside of the booth is red, velvet, plush, there's lighting, there's sound. So it's meant to create the experience of being in a theater, but within this mysterious box. So there you can see the slider that opens. And here you can see a little bit of what the audience member sees. There's a proscenium, there's lights around it, and the slider opens. So as I mentioned, we perform in public spaces. Our first public performance was in Times Square. And since then, we've been performing at universities, at different arts organizations. And usually the way it starts is that when we know where we're going to perform, we commission writers to write plays. And I usually give them a phrase to start with. Carmelita Tropicana is one of our writers who's here, right here. And for example, when we performed at Arts Brookfield, the phrase was, "I'm not the stranger you think I am." Because really what's happening is that in this moment, the actor and the audience member are encountering each other as strangers. They don't know who is performing, they don't know what to expect, and it's really about being present to whatever happens in that moment. This was another performance we did, and you can see more clearly what happens inside the booth. And the phrase here was, "in this moment." One of the things about the work that we do is that we're able to respond really intentionally to what is happening. This was a work that was created right before Trump was elected. And in the days that followed, our writers rewrote some of their pieces to take into account what was happening. And because they're usually 3 to 5 minute pieces, the writers have an ability to write something that they're feeling in the moment. A lot of the work that we do is born of what I like to call a gift economy. I don't know if you're familiar with Lewis Hyde's book called The Gift, but he talks about how the exchange of gifts moves in a circular way. And in theater, for one, we imagine that the writer is given the gift of a place to write and an audience, and that in turn, we ask the writer to consider writing the piece for an actor that they know, if that's something that they're interested in doing. And then when the performer is giving the performance, they're of course giving the gift of their performance, but more importantly, the audience member is gifting the gift of their full attention. And it's this reciprocal energy loop and this equalization of the relationship between the actor and the audience member that is so much about what it makes it feel really resonant. One of the other things about Theater for One is that in this form, everything is magnified. So every gesture, every sound cue, every light cue is like you're seeing it under a magnifying glass. As I mentioned, we do have sound, we have lighting, so it's a fully produced theatrical experience. And perhaps the most resonant element of Theater for One is the eye contact. One of the things that we have our writers and our performers realize is that it's so rare that we spend time in a space with somebody for 5 minutes maintaining eye contact. And that alone is an incredibly powerful experience. Science tells us that when we make eye contact, the same parts of our brains are activated at the same time. So our mirror neurons are activating the same parts in our limbic systems. And so that feeling of connection is deep and true and physical as well as psychological. It really began as an experiment. What happens if you put one actor and one audience member in a room together? And as we continue that spirit of experimentation, what happens when we put humans in these situations together? What happens? And of course, we all had during the pandemic a call to experiment with the forms that we were making, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement. It was a time where we were facing historic crises and historic opportunities, both to reinvent how we imagine theater and to reinvent how we create theater. By Arts Brookfield, we were invited to create an online version, which is something that I had always resisted because that sense of eye contact and presence is so important. But in this new landscape, it was clear that our computers had become our prosceniums, and the glass of our screens was the fourth wall that we had to break through. So we decided to experiment, and we worked with a company called Open Ended Group to create our own digital platform. We really wanted, in the same way that Theater for One, the booth is a physical bespoke space, we wanted our virtual space to be similarly specific and bespoke for our purposes. We hired or commissioned eight BIPOC writers, including Carmelita, and we had a creative team of all women, all BIPOC artists creating the work. And the way it works is that when you sign into the digital platform, you're in a waiting room. And in this waiting room, you are invited to make your presence known. There is a text box that comes up, and you see this text box that is pulsing in space. And when you type a message into it, your words float into the space and they float out, and others' words float in and float out. And so you have this shared experience of waiting for the performance. And it was really moving to discover that it was that place of silence and and connecting without seeing each other, without knowing each other's names. There was this anonymous void that we were in, and it really felt like we were speaking soul to soul. And from the waiting room, you would come into your performance, which was still live, still one actor and one audience member. And one of the other things we did was that because of how important eye contact is to the work that we do, we worked with our team to create a system whereby the actor and the audience member could make eye contact at the same time. We all know that so much of our Zoom experience is bifurcated by the fact that you're constantly looking down to the side or looking back and forth between the person and yourself. And so in this platform, you don't see yourself at all, but the actor has a way through, we used a teleprompter and a digital camera and an iPad so that the performer can look into the eyes of the audience member at the same time. Also, during the pandemic, we were able to build a second physical booth, which is ADA accessible, and we hope to continue to perform with that booth. I always like to say that theater for one is made by many. Even though we are making theater for one person, it requires directors, actors, designers, writers, dramaturgs, house managers, and all of us working together to create that one experience, that one shared experience. And I'll just close with a few quotes. The essence of the gift is that it creates a set of relationships. The currency of a gift economy at its root is reciprocity. It is this dance of cross-pollination that can produce a new species of knowledge, a new way of being in the world. That's from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And I really think that it's that sense of equalization between actor and audience member, and the reciprocity of giving that performer or that audience member your full presence and what happens in that sphere. And I was listening to Sarah's talk prior to this, and she talked about her album called Intimate Strangers. And it's the idea of using intimacy as a medium, the way that painters use paint, that as designers, directors, artists, social activists, that we can try to create these intimate encounters, and it's through that intimacy that we have a shared experience. And the last quote is, "To feel the love of people we love is a fire that feeds our life, but to feel the affection that comes from those whom we do not know, from those unknown to us, that still is great. That is still greater and more beautiful because it widens out the boundaries of our being and unites all living things." So that's the mission of Theater for One, one audience member at a time. And I think we probably are at time because I know we started late, but I would love it if we could take a moment and just turn to the person next to you. Yeah, just turn and face the person next to you. And just take a moment. Ada, silence. Just take a silent moment and look into the eyes of the person you're with. Take an inhale and an exhale. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's exciting to be able to show you some of the designs I've done. This is an overview of the work that I did as a furniture designer starting in 1988 when I lived in San Francisco up until 2012. I was very blessed to have a lot of clients and museums who allowed me to create oftentimes one-of-a-kind pieces. And I was also lucky to be in a city, San Francisco and then New York, where there were a plethora of artisans and craftspeople who could just do about anything that I could envision. It was a total wonderful experience for me. So the first thing, let's have the first slide, please. The first piece I want to show you is this started because I decided to create some furniture for my own home. I received an inheritance, and I happened to be dating someone who was a cabinet maker at the time, and I put together some sketches and drawings. I was taught how to draw to scale, and I created what you see, the chairs there, I call the domino chairs. The table edge that you see close in is the Zanzibar table, and that console against the wall is the Zulu console. And all of the pieces that I created have some connection to my life in some way. The patterns of the cowhides, because I grew up in Texas, the Zanzibar and the Zulu influences, because of the fact that at that point in history, we were having Black Power movements and learning so much about Africa and the different cultures there. Next, please. Also, there was a whole group of pieces that I created. You'll see a better picture of them later on, but there's the Beastie Bench here, and that was a kind of play off of the Beastie Boys, and it's a cement bench that's covered with fiberglass, so it's an outdoor piece, and the people who bought that piece back in 1988 say that they're still able to use them, they're still in good condition. Next, please. And I couldn't believe it when I was approached by a large retailer, Roche-Bobois, to do a collection for them, and that they allowed me to art direct my own image for the postcard they did to promote the work in the showrooms. And that's one of my wonderful friends, Ivory, being a Zulu jumping into the air, but nude. I couldn't believe it. They let us get away with that. The next one, please. And I've done a lot of these little side tables in all kinds of shapes. All of these have the little stair-step shapes, but what's really exciting and fun about them is all of the different finishes. Sometimes I even did automotive finishes on pieces, and another material called Zolatone, which had this grainy feeling to it. It was really amazing. Next, please. I'm very much into jewelry, and so I kind of have bejeweled a lot of pieces of furniture where I like to hang things on them. This hunter screen was inspired by a shirt that I saw in the Museum of African Art, that the hunter has all of these amulets and things hanging on his shirt as protective armor. And so this screen is lacquered, it's silver-leafed. Can I have the next slide, please? And you can see it's hung with all kinds of natural objects. It was really great to do this, put this together for my presentation here, because quite honestly, I had forgotten about a lot of these pieces, and it's really been interesting to me to see that things that I did so long ago, in 1988, 1989, 1990, that I've now come back and I'm still doing those kinds of things. So this is something that's very integral to my aesthetic. Next, please. This is called the Amazon mirror. I have a friend of mine, sister, had these types of birds, and they molt a lot. So they started giving me all of the feathers. Aren't they just gorgeous, the blue? And I found these blue glass beads also that I put on it. It's covered in leather, and then I drew in 14-karat gold pins those patterns that you see. Next, please. You can see a better detail of it there. Again, next please, you will see this is the Arizona, New Mexico elevation mirror. I've taken two, maybe three trips across the country, across America. It is an astoundingly beautiful place. There were areas of the desert, and then you're going through all of this reds and golds and orange colors, and then you start going up in elevation, and you're in Colorado, and it is vibrant green, and there are white aspen trees. And as I was traveling on this trip, I just started gathering things along the way. So those big bones are buffalo bones, they're cow jaw bones and coyote bones. Next, please. They're feathers. There's, as you can see, a turtle shell. These are things that I found just exploring the earth, just walking around as I was doing these journeys across the country. Those are wild turkey feathers. I don't know if you know, but the wild turkey was considered first as one of the birds that would have been the national bird before the eagle was selected. And that's because wild turkeys are tremendously smart. And they can disappear and vanish from you. By the time you get your gun up, they're gone. Next, please. This is the San Francisco, New York elevation mirror, and it's actually kind of a reaction. 2005 is when I created this, that of my journey. As I said, all the work is a reflection of my history. And in this case, I moved from San Francisco in 1999 to New York to marry that cutie pie on the front seat there. And these are things that remind me of both cities. The industrial, the handmade. San Francisco had a large manufacturing community, and so, of course, as you know, New York did. Next, please. So you can see that I've just really gone crazy with all kinds of fun objects hanging on this map. This is owned by a woman named Gwen Quinn, who is a well-known publicist for people like Aretha Franklin and a lot of people in the music industry. Next, please. I'm obsessed with mirrors because I guess I must be vain. And so I've done a whole series called Because You're Worth It. Some of you may remember that was a L'Oreal commercial tagline. And so my connection with that tag is that all of the mirrors have to have some kind of objects on them or be covered in some way with things that have a monetary value. In this case, this mirror has a lot of tokens and antique coins, and that is copper leaf that is underneath it. Next, please. Now you can see the full mirror. And what's been great is actually most of those coins we got when we were on a trip in Taiwan. And we took tours around the city, and we were in a place called Snake Alley. And so these coins are copper, and as you can see, what I'm really loving about this mirror is it's changing over time. Next, please. So I wanted you to see one of another mirror. I've done a whole series of them with stamps because, of course, that's another type of currency or something that can be exchanged for money. So there's been all kinds of different stamps that were all about nature or stamps that were the faces of presidents and things like that. Next, please. So I wanted you to see one of my sketch pages. This is where I allow my imagination to just go crazy and just be non-judgmental and just let it just all pour out on the page. And then I sit on it for a week or so, and I come back to it. I read the notes that my client has given me about what their vision is, what they want, and then after that, I can draw to scale the piece, talk to my artisans and craftspeople, and then create the work for them. Next, please. So this is the piece that came from that page. It's called the Scroll Table, you can see why. And let's have the next one. Now you see the detail. It's a beautiful wood veneer that has been silver leafed with that pattern that you see around the edges. Next, please. This is called the Indonesian Pebble Dining Table. This is one of my favorite pieces, although I drove maybe 2 glass blasters, kind of almost had a nervous breakdown doing this, the pebbles that they had to engrave underneath it, sandblast. The trough is filled with Indonesian pebbles, which are that beautiful blue color, almost like the glass. And then the base is wood, but it's covered in cement. These people lived right on the Pacific Ocean. There was a flood. This table was sitting in water for a week and a half, and it's still in great shape because of the fact that it was concrete. Next, please. I'm just enthralled, as a lot of people of my generation are, with constellations, with astrology. So you're gonna sometimes see these kinds of things come up. But for this particular table, the couple were both scientists. One a bioscience, one in other types of chemical science. And so I decided to make these, the base to represent the universe and the types of microscopic objects that they were looking at through microscopes. Next, please. So wonderful. Another great craftsperson I find can put objects, wire, paint between two sheets of glass and put it in a kiln and melt those two pieces of glass together. So that's what's happening on the surface there, and the whole thing is kept inside a frame. Next, please. This is a dining room table set. The couple had young children, and they did not want, they liked to have flower arrangements at the table, and they didn't want to have the water rings that were happening, so I made the center of the table glass. And this was their breakfast room table, and I wanted to make it fun for the kids. So I did my favorite fun thing that I do with the base of the table. And then those are chairs that have black leather upholstery on them. They're hand carved. There are starburst and a sunburst patterns on the back. And a star is another sun, but they're just further away and not as big for us. Next, please. This is my Bakuba Griffin dining table. This is one of my favorite pieces. That's a metal top in steel. It has been rusted and patinaed in a Bakuba pattern. And then those legs, of course, as you can see, are carved out of mahogany and rubbed down with gold powder. That top is a Bakuba cloth, inspired by a Bakuba cloth, because in those tribes, the women do the weaving and the men do the foraging for the materials to make the tops, and to make the Bakuba cloth. And I just thought that was a beautiful metaphor for the family coming together over a meal, that both the males and the females in the family contribute to that. Next, please. So I've done several of these U-shaped consoles. That strip across the center is the drawer box. That's a stainless steel base. I'm sorry, that's an aluminum base that has been ground with a drill to get that beautiful, like machine tooled finish to it. And it's sitting on a plinth. Well, it's interesting that piece of furniture inspired me to do something different, to take away and eliminate part of the design. Because as it was being constructed, when I visited the shop, next please, this is how it looked before I put the box at the bottom. And I actually liked the balance of that and the lightness of that. And instead, we sprayed this one with a copper finish, and after it was ground for that beautiful finish. And that drawer box this time is covered with a laminate that is a copper patinaed that has aged and then been stopped at that point, where you have those beautiful blues and oranges and reds that happen with copper. Next, please. So as I said, I'm so inspired by different cultures. It's just wonderful to read about them, to bring them into my work, to do cross-pollinizations. In this case, This headrest console is inspired by African headrests because they do these amazing hairstyles and they don't want their hair to be messed up when they're sleeping, so they sleep on these, and I know you've seen them, they're used a lot as decorative objects. And also the headrest that that Africans and Japanese do as well. So these two cultures, the Japanese and the African cultures, that I decided to combine in this piece, which is, again, a rusted steel that we stop the rusting at a place where we want it to, and then it's sealed. Next, please. So I'm over the top. I do too much of everything. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm about to mix, I'm skipping one. This is another console. This was part of a whole suite that I did for a hotel right on the gates to Chinatown in San Francisco. And so there's other pieces of furniture, there's other tables and everything, but the whole theme for all of them for me was the Harlequin pattern. And so some of them are painted, some of them are tables, but in this case, I wanted you to see another console that I'd done, and it's stacked with 8 sheets of glass on top. Now next. So this is my neoclassic coffee table. I really love doing these stacks of moldings and then having them gold or silver or copper leafed. I love having these animal type feet on things, and we do a lot of nail heads in them because I want you to be able to vacuum and clean your house and not worry about you nicking the furniture, so you actually end up hitting the nails. So I think being a female as a furniture designer is an advantage for me in some ways because I'm really living with how furniture and how you have to live with it in your home if you have children or, you know, you got to clean, whatever, you know, that you want the furniture to still survive and still look beautiful. Next, please. So again, I'm stacking furniture. This was a jewelry chest, believe it or not, for a person who is a big jewelry collector. And there's a hidden compartment in there as well. Also, this lady collected antique doll furniture. So next, please. I created a little stage for some of her favorite pieces in this, and she's really happy with it. It also lights up, as you could see in that previous image on the top. Next. Again, I wanted you to see another sketch page. This is, I had a commission to create a chest of drawers for a woman who had worked with several World Health organizations and lived all over the world, and had especially been happy with her times living in parts of Africa. And so I wanted to very much bring that into the piece. And also we turned out to have, both of us, a love of elephants. I'm so in love with elephants. I'm pretty sure I was one in a past life. Next, please. So this is the piece that I came up with. It's called the Luba Yoruba chest. You can see the elephant feet there, but I've decorated them with their own little anklet. And the drawers are amber beads. The drawer pulls, are amber beads. And I'm just really happy with the carver, how we were able to have the recessed and the relief part and just leave the wood the natural color in the recessed parts and only stain what was on the top surface. Next, please. This is the De Medici cabinet. This is the second one. This belongs to the Oakland Museum. The first one was commissioned by Robin Williams and his wife, and this was in their breakfast room as well. And I had a woman who was just amazing, who could paint anything that I could imagine. So she created this really beautiful drawings and paintings on this piece. Next, please. And as you can see, even inside, I'm very much about every aspect of the works underneath, the sides, in being finished and beautiful, no matter where you look at them. Even the back side of this piece, even though it's against a wall, is also gorgeous. And next, please. This surface is leather that we've wrapped over the wood, and it's been burned and stained into this Mabuti pattern. that I found. I had a Mabuti cloth that was the inspiration for this. Next, please. So another sketchbook page. This time I got to just have my own imagination. The piece didn't have to be functional, and it wasn't for any client. I was doing this for a show called, it was a group show, and it was all chairs. So this, next please, this chair is musical. It's the Dogon chair. Those are copper pipes that we've wrapped with tape and patinaed in either the beautiful blue color that copper can be patinaed to, or those golden bronzy tones. And when you sit down in the chair, they hit each other and you have sounds. Next. So you can see now how also we've pulled copper wire up through some amber beads at the top. And this is a better shot for you to see the chimes that are on the back. So I had a client who saw that one and asked for one next for herself, and I can never do the same thing exactly the same. So unless a manufacturer is doing one of my designs, even if you ask for the same piece that I did for somebody else, just like twins aren't the same, my furniture can't be exactly the same. So in this case, I did a different type of wood, and I used, I had been to Italy not too long before I got this commission, and I used a lot of the Murano glass that I collected while I was in Italy. Next, please. Then a client who is a really great friend of mine and also has commissioned a lot of works for me, built a compound for his family in Texas on their ancestral land, and so I had this chair made in Costa Rica out of Guanacaste wood that can handle all kinds of outdoor weather. As you can see, it's a lot larger, and I hung this on the back with Japanese calligraphy brushes. Next. And this shows you the full installation after it was done. I also did the panels that are on the wall around it. It's in Texas, so you know it's in a lot of heat, but I use billboard paint, and of course that can handle anything. Next. This is a bed that's for a little girl. She's not a little girl anymore, but I understand she's kept the bed. And this is the headboard. Those spheres are in the exact constellation for when she was born. And the bottom, the footboard, she could look through it and things would be upside down, or, like when you're looking through a magnifying lens. So it was a fun, joyful piece, and I actually ended up doing beds for all three of the children. Next, please. And this is the bed I did for their parents. This I consider one of my masterpieces. Because I was allowed to have full artistic freedom and an open budget, and I was able to work with glass pourer, a glass blower, a person who could carve. I had a metal workers. It was just fantastic. And on the back, it's a bookcase, because when they walk, it faces onto their bathroom and their dressing room. So this is called the Scheherazade bed, and the side tables, the one that you can see there was the husband's bed. He was born in California, and the symbol for California, the animal, is a bear, so I gave him bare feet. And he was he was a person who got more and more vibrant as the evening went on. So at nighttime, I gave him the night, and his wife and I would start talking on the phone at 5 o'clock in the morning. So we were the early birds. So she has bird claw feet on hers. Next, please. And this is just a nicer, a tighter shot for you to see some of the houses that are on the top of the piece. I'm almost done. The next piece is also, next please, another piece that I consider a masterpiece. And I get to have an opportunity when I have a client. The bed was a client who had worked with me a long time, and by the time I did that piece, they really trusted me and gave me bigger and bigger budgets. In this case, I was commissioned by San Francisco Museum of Modern Art to create a piece for their permanent collection. And so I was able to be the client. And so those vitrines are filled with objects that have a relationship to my life. They even have my hair in it, so at some time in the future, people will like test that and maybe make a new Cheryl out of the hair, which may not be a good idea. I love getting jewelry as gifts. So there's those Tiffany boxes right there, you know. So it's different things like that. My tarot reading that week is in there as well. So everything is glued down. That's when I learned that there's different glues for everything. And then next, please. This shows you the underside of the piece. My woman who painted the other piece, these are the eyes of women from Italian Renaissance paintings, because I feel like women are seldom sometimes really looked in the eye and listened to and looked in that way. And then there's a crown again of my favorite stone, the amber, and the wings underneath are because my mother, when I asked her why I had dimples, she said that it's because the angels kissed me when I was a baby. So those are the angel wings. And next, please. This is the full table. It's resting on what I had carved that were Zulu spoons. And those spoons are, of course, a female figure. The Zulus are nomadic people, so everything that they have has to have multiple functions. And oftentimes they are decorative as well as functional. So I wanted to show Europe's need to rest on the wealth and the knowledge of Africa. So it's a symbolic in that way. And that's the end. Thank you.
Okay, hey everybody. My name is Peter Ballman. I'm one half of an architecture company firm called Ballman Khapalova. Unfortunately, my partner and better half, Dasha, is not able to be here tonight, but we're very, very proud to be here. I'm going to talk tonight about well, first of all, I'm going to read from the script because otherwise we'll be here all night. I'm going to talk tonight about work that we do that focuses on creating theoretical proposals for distressed and overlooked urban sites. We're doing these projects so that we can work at a scale that we feel has the actual ability to create. Okay? All right, cool. So we're working at this scale because we feel that there's potential to actually create real change in the urban environment through the creation of unique public spaces. So out of this theoretical work came a very real proposal for a park in Lower Manhattan, which I'm going to share. We've been working on the project for about 3 years and have presented it several times, usually as a kind of development pitch. Some of the roadblocks and complexities that we've encountered have inspired us to evolve the way that we're thinking about the project beyond that. It's inspired us to consider how it might open up a possibility for a new kind of social and spatial practice. The title that we've given this body of work in today's talk is Betwixt and Between, which to us implies a kind of fluidity of working between different layers of information, a certain comfort that we aspire to in existing and working in a neither nor state, and ultimately to being able to tap into the creative potential that is there at an urban scale. My goal is that by the end of this talk, this drawing makes sense to you. There's also an implication that we're living in an in-between time, between one paradigm that is increasingly dysfunctional and another, a possible future that has not yet taken shape, but that must succeed in correcting the mistakes of the past. We as architects, of course, believe that architecture has a unique role in doing this, in shaping this future. But architecture has a history problem. Historically, architecture has been a tool of power. Because of its scale, duration, and cost, it requires political stability, commitment to various parties over time, and a lot of money. The span of a project makes it almost impossible for architecture to respond to urgent issues in real time. And so built works tend to propagate a consistent, persistent set of social and political and economic ideas, while architectural innovation becomes more and more theoretical and rhetorical. Built architecture becomes a means of legitimizing whatever powers may be. In our day, this value system is expressed through speculative real estate development, which tends to be indifferent to the history, culture, and diversity that make up the actual fabric of a city, and they give the city its character and its vitality. Public spaces in this model either become justification for more towers, or it's relegated to awkward strips of leftover space. Outside the cities, of course, there is an unyielding expansion of suburbanization, which is equally indifferent to variations in landscape and climate. And architecture has been a tool through the so-called Bilbao effect, which has been the dominant paradigm for at least 20 years for these forms of expansion. Architectural programs such as museum or theater or even community center, all of which have their origin as truly cultural and civic programs, are more often than not deployed to pacify, sanitize, and clear the way for this process. So instead of looking at traditional models of designing buildings and conventional public spaces, we're interested in what happens when these kinds of massive projects cut through the city fabric, what they leave in their wake, and how the memory of what was might become embedded in what replaces it. Cities have to grow, infrastructure has got to be built, but instead of a tabula rasa approach which relies on the falsehood of a clean slate or the idea of starting from scratch, we are interested in the possibility of something revelatory emerging out of these conditions. We see the city in layers like a palimpsest, a text of texts. This drawing of St. Peter's in Rome shows a history that goes far beyond what is visibly perceptible on the surface. Our intention is to do this for cities. Even in the US, where city fabric is considered to be quite young, there are histories and stories that can add texture to a site and give purpose to a project. Identifying these stories and drawing them out is like mapping a course of a river over time. The space in between buildings is as important as the buildings themselves. In the current climate of expansive development, urban space has been understood as a last hope for social action. This empty space can allow for informal, unscripted, unregulated, unplanned activities that are open to all. So the space of the unbuilt is by default a space of the people, space for activism, protest, a place for people's voices to be heard, where those voices can gain notice and influence to some degree. So the question for us becomes, how can we find public space that can resist the tabula rasa erasure of urban development, to find a way to articulate layers of history and intention that may otherwise go without a voice, and to ultimately provide a space that's truly for people? As Sigmund Freud said, and more importantly as the great Diane Lewis taught her students at the Cooper Union, the city can and should be understood as a psyche, where all previous versions and incarnations are simultaneously present and can be accessed. Like the psyche, the city is a place of buried seeds, stories, impulses, compulsions, and desires containing the origin of creativity and action. We believe that these forces can be tapped if one looks in the right place, even if those places are some places that you'd prefer not to be looking. The areas that we call broken sites resist traditional forms of development. They arise in different ways, through the imposition of infrastructure, through uneven distribution of wealth. Some are industrial wastelands, some are scars that separate neighborhoods, or an unresolved boundary between a city's fabric and a threatening landscape. As designers, we like these sites because they're so challenging, but we also think that if you can come up with the right solution to these kinds of situations, then there's potential to make a significant impact on the quality of the city and the lives of the people living in it without having to erase everything. Here in Detroit, we see a difficult condition. This is kind of an example of a freeway slicing a neighborhood in two halves, creating a void. And here in Syracuse, where an elevated freeway does the same thing from above, acting more like a wall. Typologies of infrastructure and the forms that it takes tends to be quite standard, but the conditions that it creates change depending on the environment that it's imposed upon. To understand a broken site at the specific micro level, it's necessary to understand its greater ecological, urban, and economic context. So for this project, we identified New York, Detroit, New Orleans, and Los Angeles as representatives of 4 quadrants of the United States. Major cities that each engage with a specific set of environmental conditions and cultural and economic histories. Taken together, these can serve as a kind of cross-section that tells a social, ecological, and urban story about America, and that can help contextualize future projects. Each city is understood as being defined as its entire footprint, its entire ecological footprint or area of influence. So here you see Los Angeles as the whole West Coast moving up to the Rockies. You see New Orleans is occupying the entirety of the Mississippi Basin and its watershed. Detroit, the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, and North Atlantic watersheds. And New York, the chain of the Appalachians breaking off just as it touches the Atlantic. Each of these ecological contexts sets a different tone for understanding specific issues at micro level. Similarly, each city represents a larger network of regional cities and economies. The West Coast cities, the cities that exchange goods and culture up and down the Mississippi and the Gulf, the Rust Belt, and the historic region of government in the Northeast. This provides a family of issues for each city that helps to understand its cultural influence on the rest of the country. And these cities are all tied together by layers of infrastructure, each of which carries with it a certain history of progress and a history of violence. The railroad, the primary means of westward expansion, was also the primary weapon of genocide. The Jeffersonian grid, a drawing on the ground pixelating the landscape into 1 mile squares, domesticates the land and facilitates a mentality of arrogance and indifference to region and climate. And the interstate system that ties everything together and that is particularly problematic when it penetrates and terminates within cities. These are the infrastructural foundations of our nation, monuments to our cultural and environmental bias. Working on and with them might allow us to engage these issues in a tangible way. So the first broken site that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to try to run through quickly, is Los Angeles. We actually started in New York, and then we moved to Los Angeles, or we started working in Los Angeles, and then are working on the two projects simultaneously. They're both kind of evolving. Detroit and New Orleans are actually very difficult because the infrastructure and social issues are so entwined and so pervasive that we're having to evolve our approach a little bit. So we're slowly doing that. But in LA, we're looking at the city-linked infrastructural monolith that is the Los Angeles River. While only a trickle in its original state, the river flooded massively, so it was channelized in order to prevent flooding and therefore to enable residential development in the heart of the city, as this is at the time when the city was being founded. While the city as a whole has many charms, ocean, hills, endless variety of cultural spaces, there are few of these in the areas that the river passes through. The gateway cities, as these neighborhoods are known, include some of the most densely populated municipalities in the US, and they are landlocked on an arid plain with little direct access to the amenities beyond what the specific neighborhood has to offer. But they are nevertheless thriving neighborhoods for the city's working class. This is a drawing that we did of the river. Each of these are individual paintings that correspond to specific neighborhoods or clusters of blocks. Influenced by Richard Diebenkorn's Ocean Park series, we wanted the fabric to reflect the varieties and quality of light in the LA sky, which would eventually carry through into our proposal. This contrasts starkly with the current efforts to create a green zone or linear park within and around the channel, and treating the river essentially as a new highline. These efforts use the park concept, much in the way that it was describing the Bilbao effect, to attract development and tourists, activating the space of the river and driving up values in existing neighborhoods. This will cause these residents to become marginal by comparison and eventually to be pushed out. Our proposal suggests an alternate solution based on a completely different reading of the river, one that considers it as entirely indigenous to Los Angeles and seeks to harmonize it as it is with the surrounding city fabric in a site-specific way. We don't seek to falsely naturalize this environment within the river. Instead, seeing the river as a channel and a receiver of light and a conduit for wind that could create a serene and surreal space, we propose a series of structures that extend from the city fabric into the space to the river to create a spine of civic and cultural space that's accessed directly by the inhabitants of the gateway cities. Here we are conscious not to create a park because we know that the park will lead to development and gentrification. Instead, we propose a way to utilize the river as an asset to improve the lives of the people that already live there, connecting the neighborhoods together, providing an armature for shared civic facilities, and providing easy access to the much-needed breeze. So that's kind of an example of how we approach a broken site. Now here we are in New York, where the Appalachians meet the Atlantic. The relationship between rock, earth, and water will define the way that the city will grow. Here's the infrastructure that carries water from the Catskills, and here's the network of roads that cross this terrain to get into the city. These infrastructures converge in many places, creating unique spatial, technological, and urban conditions that can reveal much about the nature of what it means to live in this city, in this site. We explore the different means of navigating the relationship between transportation and water and the different urban conditions, problems, and solutions that result. Our broken sites, and these are the kind of some results here, these peculiar set of objects. Our broken site for New York we call bridge and tunnel, because they're all about the way that you navigate the relationship between water and earth in order to access the city and what happens when that hits the fabric. For brevity's sake, we're focusing only on Lower Manhattan, but obviously there's a multitude of these conditions around the 5 boroughs. Our interest in Manhattan is the relentlessness of the city grid and the potential for breaks in this grid to open up space. As you can see here, infrastructure is a prime agent in breaking up the grid and in preserving space within and around it. While that space is typically quite awkward, the scale of space, when compared to the city block, is significant if it can be skillfully carved out. St. John's Park, at the terminus of the Holland Tunnel, is one place where this can happen. The Rotary was constructed in the 1960s and distributes 100,000 cars every day in 5 different directions within a relatively small footprint. Its existence preserves an unusually large amount of open space, totaling 4.5 acres between sidewalks, even though this space is largely inaccessible to pedestrians. It's also an intersection of these neighborhoods that lack a significant public space to share. But because the space is uncrossable, the Rotary forms an enormous obstacle in passing from one to another, creating a kind of stagnant area in the city. If that obstacle were to be cleared, an opportunity for circulation between these neighborhoods and the increased openness to the activities of Canal would create a truly active, connected public space, similar to the central fountain of Washington Square Park. But how we open up the center of the site is not immediately clear. From the vantage point of the traditional development model, which funds public space through real estate, it doesn't really make sense. There's no available FAR to bargain with, so there's no opportunity to develop towers. There's perhaps an opportunity to marginally increase the value of the surrounding buildings, but not enough to make the cost of the construction make sense. And of course, there's a huge piece of infrastructure there that keeps you from getting to the best part of the site. So what are you going to do? And since the Rotary does what it's supposed to do, there's really not any incentive to change it. But still, there is potential for something incredible here. By separating the space of the pedestrian from the space of the car and creating space around the roadway by the introduction of a new level, it is possible to experience the entirety of the available 4.5 acres of space. That's a little more than the entirety of the High Line, all compacted into one spot. Within this central space of the Rotary, which is in diameter about the same as the length of the drill hall next door, there can be a place to play, a place to exhibit and experience art, or a place to temporarily get lost in the wilderness. There can be a protective arcade to allow comfortable passage through the space in all seasons. And around the perimeter is approximately 70,000 square feet of skylit interior spaces that could show art, be a space for education, or my personal favorite, a bathhouse. The ground forms a continuous plane with the sidewalk for pedestrian circulation. And the new upturned walls of the Rotary protect from the sight, the sound, and the fumes of vehicles, while also framing a completely unique upward perspective of the city. The circular frame can also be activated as a screen, a cyclorama to view works of art. The frame also operates at street level, giving a sculptural quality to the Rotary and delineates space for small parks at sidewalk level. So that's the pitch for the park. The question is, how should the park be used? How should it be programmed? And this is where we came to a halt. In a sense, finding the space was the easy part. But the way that we're showing these spaces in this pitch deck that I've just given to you are fairly commonplace. The space of the Rotary is a container, but for what exactly? We tried all of these programs in one way or another that I'm listing here, and all could potentially work. But does it make sense to apply conventional usage to such an unconventional space? Or conversely, is there a way that these conventional programs such as gallery or auditorium can be informed by the site itself? And what is the site itself exactly? So begins our investigation into the story of the site. So this is what it means to work on a broken site. But first, before I do that, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Tribeca is not exactly a marginal neighborhood. Very true, not anymore. Unlike the LA River, the goal here is not to provide an amenity necessarily to provide an amenity to the immediate neighborhood to make it more valuable, but rather the opposite, to open up an exclusive neighborhood to everyone. As you will see, this site has essentially always been exclusive in one way or another. Here is the Wallachia Project's Manhattan map showing the natural state of the island, as far as we can understand it, of the island as of 1609. This is the last time that this space was completely free. You can see that the site sits on a kind of peninsula surrounded by a swamp. That swamp is a major character as the area develops. In the 1640s, the site is part of a Dutch farm. Like all of the other farms south of it, it is sustained, at least in part, by slave labor. It is also the northern vanguard of the colony. During this period, there's intense fighting with the Lenape, who obviously the natural inhabitants of the island. And the marshland was a kind of battlefield over the frontier. So the cynical Dutch solution to this problem was to provide land to freed slaves, specifically the poor land in the marsh across the swamp between the colony and the Lenape, so that it formed a kind of buffer zone. This area, which would be known as the Negro Plantations, or alternately the land of the blacks, is considered to be one of the first communities of freed Africans in this country. When the English took possession of the colony, these land rights would be revoked, and the area would again become a fortified perimeter. You can see here the defenses that show up again in the Revolutionary War. After the war, the grid was established and residents began moving northward. This area was developed to be an exclusive neighborhood modeled on London's West End. The neighborhood would center around a formal park. This would be the first example of a park used for speculative real estate purposes in New York City. You can see here also that in order to develop this land, the canal would have to be built in order to drain the swamp, hence Canal Street. The park would eventually be built as a more formal square with a fence around it, similar to Gramercy Park. It would be accessible only by the wealthy residents living around it. St. John's Chapel, which would eventually give the park its name, was constructed as part of the development. Again, an example of the relationship between park, architectural program, and development. This is the Veal map of 1865 that is the first kind of palimpsest drawing that shows everything up to that point. The original coastline, the marsh, the grid, native topography. Shortly thereafter, a year after this map was created, in 1866, the park was demolished. By this time, the neighborhood had become industrial and the residents more working class, while previous upper class residents moved north. Cornelius Vanderbilt's St. John's Freight Depot was constructed to house the trains that serviced the West Side Railroad, which at that time was at street level. The depot was basically the most important structure in the area for decades and took up the entire block. However, by the late 20s, because the West Side Rail was at street level, the persistent danger caused by the rail to pedestrians, obviously, caused the rail line to be elevated, which would be the future High Line. A new terminal would be built, Washington Street and the Vanderbilt Depot demolished in 1927. Sharing the same fate as St. John's Chapel, which had been torn down in 1918. Activity in the site in the area would eventually die down as industry moved closer to the rail line. The site remained dormant for the next 50 years. Through the 60s, there exists on zoning maps a sketch for an elevated freeway connecting the tunnel exit, the West Side, and an elevated Lower Manhattan Expressway. You can imagine the devastating effects on these neighborhoods would that have been built. Many other places in the city have not been spared this fate. In the late 60s, the Rotary was built, so we can appreciate now its relatively small footprint. In 1980, Richard Serra's St. John's Ark was installed within the Rotary, presenting a very interesting and provocative precedent here for merging the worlds of infrastructure and culture, much like what's going on at Freeman Plaza, just north of the site. There's also an intersection of types of infrastructure. Here you can see a hole in the northwest corner of the site. This is an access shaft for water tunnel number 3, which runs below the site, providing water to Lower Manhattan. Looking at water in a different way, here is the FEMA map showing both the 100-year and 500-year flood. This water pattern is consistent with the flooding during Sandy and follows the original condition of the swamp. So the rotary site still sits on this peninsula, so it remains protected. The question then becomes, is it possible for the site to use this position to relieve some of the immediate effects of flooding for this area? So now I've walked you through all the different layers and strata here of this site. The question is, how does all this add up? How does this influence the way that we start to understand the site? And how can that new understanding be used? How can it redefine the terms of the problem of how to use the site? Do we see the site as a piece of infrastructure imposed on a natural landscape? Do we understand it as a natural condition emerging and persisting through the city grid? By contrasting the bridge and tunnel drawing showing modern vehicular infrastructure with the drawing of the Native American trading routes over the land, which of course is very sensitive to the contours and topography, can we imagine a new balance between infrastructure, people, and the land to lead us to a new concept for the street in New York? And can the park in some way be an example of that? This last series of drawings juxtapose and compile all this information, bringing all the different layers that I've just described into conversation with each other. These drawings also reveal our process, our way of thinking about sites. This is a method against the tabula rasa approach. These drawings allow us to define the site by looking at all layers simultaneously, the psyche of the city, so that we can have a deeper understanding of what the site is and what it could be. This is where the form, the program, and the function should all emerge. This drawing shows the different layers of ecology, all the different water that comes up from the ground and water that comes in from the side, water that comes in through the aqueduct. This drawing shows all the different layers of infrastructure that have existed over time, including the subway tunnel now, the church as being a piece of religious infrastructure, the defensive structures, even the ghost of the potential expressway. And this shows the cultural histories and zones of the site. So we have the Negro plantations, we have the canal, we have the church, everything up to the Sarah sculpture. So the last drawing is one representation of how we see the site, not as separate layers, not as different silos of information, but as a complex balance of forces. This to us is the real site, or one version of it. And through the design and programming of the park, we can create an ideal, a new ideal for public space, a seed for regeneration of the city on its own terms, the terms of the people who live there and who have participated in these different layers in their own way over time. So the next layer, to be determined, is what the people of New York want to see here. We've recently launched a website for Rotary Park. The main purpose of the site is to explain the project, most importantly, to solicit thoughts and feelings from all New Yorkers. If you go to the site, be very clear how you can share your thoughts with us. Because we want to get people's thoughts and feelings about how this found space should be used rather than us imposing it or selling it in one way or another. In order for this to be a space for the people, it has to be conceived and supported by the people. We believe that this kind of dialogue is precisely what is needed to resist the erasure of history and culture within our cities. But more than this, the conversation must be tied to the physical space, to the architecture, so that our compulsions and our desires can be woven back into the fabric of the city, to be truly relevant to the realities of the city today and to remain so for generations to come. If we can pull this off at the Rotary, then it can serve as a model, not only for public space, but for social action to be applied, repeated, adapted to other broken sites within Manhattan, New York, and beyond. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. I'm Jeffrey Henson Scales, and welcome to a presentation from the upcoming book of my earliest photographs, In the Time of Panthers. I'd also like to thank Carrie for inviting me to participate in this grand convening of artists here at the Armory. So, this is my story, and well, I'm sticking to it.
I love the lie and lie the love. I'm hanging on, we push and shove. Jose Depression is the motivation that is hanging up the goddamn nation. Looks like we always end up in a rut. Everybody now trying to make it real compared to what? Come on, baby.
In 2018, my mother passed away peacefully in Berkeley. When our family was preparing to sell the family home, a long-forgotten collection of negative sheets from my childhood was found, photographs I had made as a teenager during the turbulent 1960s in the San Francisco Bay Area. With these aged strips of film my mother had tucked away for half a century, fragmented pieces of my memory have been returned to me like broken artifacts that now can be mended back together for display. At our family home, with its spectacular view of the San Francisco Bay in Berkeley's Claremont area, my parents, who were politically active at the time, hosted a grand party in 1967 to inaugurate and celebrate the transition in the SNCC leadership from Stokely Carmichael to H. Rap Brown. In addition to Stokely and Rap Brown, many of the local political elite were there, including Eldridge Cleaver and other members of the Black Panther Party. I have never forgotten that night. I was a middle school kid in Berkeley, but drawn to the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco where we had previously lived. One June evening, when I was just 12 years old, my parents caught me trying to climb out the fourth floor window of our home and go see Jimi Hendrix at the Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco. It was then they decided it was time for me to stay with my father's sister in Minneapolis and travel to meet my cousins in Iowa City, Davenport, Detroit, and Chicago. But the summer in the Midwest wasn't some bucolic escape from the Bay Area to visit family. On the contrary, it was to become known as the long hot summer of 1967. 159 violent uprisings broke out in black communities across the country. It was here, for the first time, I saw the brutal face of the violent repression, deprivation, and devastation in poor communities of color. One of our planned destinations was Detroit, where one of the most severe rebellions was taking place at the time. There, 43 people died and hundreds were injured. So we had to detour back into Illinois. In Chicago, I imagined meeting the likes of Muddy Waters or B.B. King as they would just be sitting around on their stoops hanging out like the bands I'd gotten to know on Asbury Street in San Francisco. And it was here, in Chicago, that my grandmother gave me a Kodak Instamatic camera for me to pursue my photography hobby. On this humble Instamatic, I created my first social documentary photos, and one of those rolls was part of the collection my mother had filed away. For the first time since 1967, I was seeing these and other negatives again. Old, dusty, and scratched, these are the only record I have of that summer. They were the first time I had made photographs in an inner city. Some of these frames reveal the time as viewed by a 13-year-old kid from Berkeley seeing the streets of Chicago for the first time that compelled me to shift my adolescent perspective. Returning to Berkeley after that Midwest summer, I was profoundly changed. I felt compelled to document these urban realities and the activists who were trying to change it, to do my part to try and change the world. By the summer of 1968, protests for civil rights, opposition to the Vietnam War, and the military draft were flourishing. My brother Michael, 4 years older, was draft eligible, so he relocated to Canada. I was just entering the 9th grade and not quite 14 years old when I began photographing the Oakland chapter of the Black Panther Party. It was a most revelatory experience. The excitement of the Black Panther movement was crystallized in their visuals: blackness, black berets, and black leather. The leadership of the Black Panthers took me under their wing and directly mentored me. I would visit Huey Newton in jail once or twice a week at the Alameda County Courthouse while he was on trial for the killing of an Oakland police officer during a traffic stop. We talked through a small viewing window framed by walls of thick steel on one of those old-style telephone receivers. Despite having been shot and being on trial for his life, he was always attentive, affable, and full of quick wit. Black Panther Party Chairman Bobby Seale encouraged me to be one of the photographers for the newspaper, the Black Panther paper. Emory Douglas, the graphic artist who art directed all the Panthers imagery as well as their newspaper, the Black Panther paper, was the first to ever publish my work. It was a graffiti-style painting I had made of little Bobby Hutton that Armory put on the cover of the paper following his murder. He even invited me to work on the newspaper at the home of its editor, Eldridge Cleaver, who, along with his wife Kathleen, lived in San Francisco. I first met Cleaver one day when I was hanging out at the Panther office in Oakland, and he stopped by. Bobby Seale came over and introduced us. He said, "Eldridge, this is Jeffrey Scales. He's going to be taking photos for the paper." Eldridge looked at me and asked, "Is Emmett Scales your father?" "Yeah," I said. "Do you still live in that big house in the Berkeley Hills?" Yeah." "Tell your dad y'all need to have a book party for my new book up there." I said, "Well, okay, I'll ask him." And a few weeks later, we had that party. Some of the photographs I took during that time haunt me more than others. Memories, of course, of those who were killed back in those days, others who are still imprisoned after decades, or others who, passed on just as life would have it, and including some memories I have of the disappointing journeys that some of my then idols made in their later years. But a few of these images evoke even stronger ghosts. It was Thursday, April 4th. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. The following Saturday in Oakland, 17-year-old Panther Bobby Hutton was killed by the Oakland police following a shootout. While surrendering with his hands raised, clad only in his underwear, emerging along with Eldridge Cleaver from a house in West Oakland which had been firebombed by police munitions, little Bobby, just a few years older than me, died in a hail of bullets. The morning after, the Panther leadership called me to come down and make some photographs. Charred debris from the basement where Eldridge and little Bobby had holed up had been dragged into the street. The smell of burnt wood and the acrid stench of tear gas and gunfire still filled the rooms inside. It was like some kind of eerie open house tour, except the walls were riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, shattered glass, and the suffocating ghost of the previous night's death stealing the air from each room. Seeing those devastated rooms in the few photographs after so many years disturbs me more than I would have imagined. They bring back the feelings I had that day, as an idealistic teenager again being confronted with another harsh reality of governmental violence directed at black activists, just days after the murder of Dr. King. In 1969, and for some years following, I made photographs during the riots in Berkeley over an empty lot turned park known as People's Park. That first day in May, the police used live shotgun rounds on the protesters and bystanders, killing one, blinding another, and injuring dozens on what became known as Bloody Thursday. It was also the first, and fortunately the only time I've experienced being shot at. In this case, it was by the police, which happened twice during those riots. At the time, I was with some protesters on the balcony of one of the buildings on the UC campus, when two officers, one with a standard 12-gauge pump-action shotgun and the other with a tear gas canister launching shotgun, approached on the street below us. The officer with the shotgun looks up at us and shoulders his weapon to fire. I knew it was time to take cover. In what memory seems like slow motion, the shot rang out at us, buckshot splattering on the pillars we had hidden behind, followed by his partner firing a tear gas grenade into the balcony where we stood. The second time I was shot at, I literally dodged a bullet. This time, I was on the street level when a group of police rounded the corner, chasing and beating all the demonstrators in their path with nightsticks, when one with a shotgun came after me. I noticed a narrow alley off the block. There, with the shotgun-toting officer in hot pursuit around 25 feet behind me, into the alley I fled, running faster than I ever had and certainly ever since. I saw before me, though, what looked like a 12-foot concrete wall dead-ending my escape route. I suspect the wall was far shorter than that, but at the time, it presented what felt like a potentially deadly obstacle. I quite literally took a leap of faith and propelled myself as forcefully and as quickly as I could to the top of the wall. And as I dropped over the other side, I heard a shotgun blast ring out, echoing off the alley walls like deadly thunder just a few meters behind me. I didn't look back, but proceeded as fast as I could, as far as my legs and the air in my lungs would take me, before looking back and saying I'd safely escaped. With the arrival of 2,700 National Guard troops overnight, Berkeley then became an occupied city. This past, that for decades remained out of reach except when drawn by my own personal mythology, has now come back to confront me as a man more than 50 years later in this new century in America. Because of chance circumstance during a sharply focused arc of American history that seemed to unfold around me when I was merely a child, much of this past not only belongs to my memory, but is one that has been fixed into our collective American psyche. Yet these memories of struggle have been returned to me at a time when there are powerful forces trying to push the clock back to a time before the years these photographs were even made. It's a desperate effort to reverse the progress America has made since that sharp arc of history helped form our contemporary and somewhat more inclusive America.
So thank you for joining. My name is Kenyon Adams. It's my pleasure to be part of this gathering, this convening, this critical time, critical gathering. So your presence is very much felt and appreciated. It takes a great deal of imagination to conceive of sustainable futures. In a recent conversation with poet Tracy K. Smith, I was struck by her description of our situatedness in relationship to history and ways in which its irresolution is upon us, even as we are reaching with aspirational proposals towards diversity sustainable futures. Tracy's perception informs the premise of this entire gathering and exhibition. The future is breaking in, yet there is a dynamic cognizance of the irresolution of the past, leaving us to navigate in our bodies the condition of being at once rooted and also reaching. So we're holding space in this room for contemplation and inquiries that sit between the root and the reach. That is, between the necessary sense of rootedness inherent to making proposals about future life and the sort of eschatological reaching that is in so many ways inherent to Black creative energy, to Black ways of being in the body, and to the force and energy of life itself. Now, the underlying assumption of the concerns we are exploring has to do with featuring both the imagination and the role of critical inquiry in the construction of what many are calling sustainable futures. I'm struck that it is remarkably easy to imagine and begin to live into, in some sense, new ways of being. Science fiction writers and filmmakers have demonstrated how even pleasurable it can be to project ourselves into futurescapes and vistas far beyond what our present resources and systems can deliver within our current experience and our shared sense of situation. It's precisely because of this ease, reflecting perhaps an affinity or capacity that is particularly human in character, that the rigor of such imaginings and the weight of such aspirations be examined and measured, such that each investment in the space of dreaming be one that is contributive to the central task of building modes of living and of human expansion, which are in effect life-giving and which can be sustained. So we're centering a few questions as a starting point for a conversation I'm calling Terraforming Blues. Terraforming Blues. It's the Terraforming Blues, or bodies in space, future sites, habitats, and mobilities. So here's a few questions just to hold in the space. I hope you'll hold it with us. What is the nature, scope, and scale or degree of imagination that is required to conceive and propose sustainable futures? All right. In what ways might the work of liberation extend itself into future sites, systems, and habitats, including those beyond Earth? 3, how does an anti-colonial view of space exploration, implicate or challenge our current notions of life in the body? And the recognition of and care for diverse bodies. Just a few questions I hope you'll hold also with us as we engage in this conversation. It's a pleasure, deep pleasure, to be joined by Dario, Calmese, Kayla, Farrish, and Danielle Wood, 3 makers and thinkers who work across disciplines and practices that collectively attend to future embodiment in sites ranging from the cover of Vanity Fair to the laboratories of dance, film, and poetics, to the International Space Station, and to the surfaces of Mars and the Moon. Each institution builders in their own right, these 3 remarkable innovators are working collectively across performance, fashion, aerospace, image making, archives, civic life, and policy. Their polyvalent vocations collectively include the roles of choreographer, urbanist, director, engineer, founder, brand consultant, dancer, photographer, designer, filmmaker, musician, actor, professor, choir master, and some such. We'll begin with a meditation and a provocation, and then continue the conversation as a group. This is a little thing called Terraforming Blues.
There are many kinds of power, used and unused, acknowledged or otherwise. The erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. Audre Lorde. During 2022, NASA is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Landsat satellite, the first in a series of 9 satellites that have been operated by the government of the United States, with the mission to acquire images of all the land on Earth regularly. Since 1972, the program led by NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey has always had at least 1 satellite orbiting the Earth every hour and a half. This orbital path over the rotating Earth gives the satellites an opportunity to pass every location on Earth every 2 weeks. Flying in a sun-synchronous orbit, the satellites see each location with the light from the sun at the same angle. This is an ideal method to gain a view of how the land is changing. The timing of the launch of Landsat 1 was perfect to witness a change that was coming to 40 square miles of land southwest of Orlando. It is wetland, where forest and lake and stream offer sanctuary and sojourn to the deer, the black bear, the alligator, and the catfish. It is the land of the Seminole people, adjoining the land of the Timucua and Tocobaga. It is farmland, where oranges and cows grow fat under the Florida sun. For several years in the 1960s, a company quietly bought about 40 square miles of this land southwest of Orlando. No one noticed at first. The company was buying enough land to create a vast and ever-evolving resort, a pleasure garden, a land of imagination and world-building. In 1971, 50 years ago, the Walt Disney Company welcomed the first visitors to the Magic Kingdom. This marked a key moment in the terraforming of these 40 square miles of land southwest of Orlando, terraforming which continues today. The erotic is a measure of the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It is an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. Audrey. Now, I grew up near these 40 square miles of land in a town on the territory of the Timucua people. This town is where I spent my childhood. It was named after Captain Maitland, who led troops in the U.S. Army against the Seminole people. My home was less than a mile from that of Zora Neale Hurston in Eatonville, the oldest black township in the U.S. As a resident of Central Florida, I regularly visited the Walt Disney World Company's land to play in their theme parks, hotels, water parks, shopping centers, movie theaters, and nightclubs. It did not seem strange to me at the time that the Walt Disney Company held the rights of a city to change, to recreate the land, the air, the water, to transform the wetlands, the forest, the lakes, the streams to a pleasure garden. It did not seem strange to me. It did not occur to me to ask what it meant for us to give permission to this company to terraform 40 square miles of land southwest of Orlando. But the Landsat satellites bore witness to the terraforming of the land. Poetry is illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are, until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed, but already felt. Audrey. The flight coach instructed us to perform push-ups every half hour to keep our bodies healthy during the 12-hour flight. We had departed from the small airport in Chile, in Punta Arenas. Early in the morning, we flew 2 hours over the Southern Ocean before we could see the rocks and ice and crevices and shadows of the Antarctic landscape. The plane, operated by NASA, carried in its belly lasers and radars that harmlessly interrogate the ice of the Antarctic. I climbed from the passenger cabin and down into the storage area of the plane, which was converted into a platform for the lasers. I could see the green light bouncing over the ice and snow below. The measurements created by the lasers and radars bear witness to the invisible hand of change as humans are bringing this change to Antarctica. It's not a place populated by large human cities, resorts, hotels, or factories, yet the actions of our global economy to generate energy are increasing the heat of our planet and quickly melting ice in Antarctica. These polar ice caps release their water, and it shows up on the shores of coastal cities around the world, cities where I often visit in my work, like Cotonou, Benin, Accra in Ghana, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Luanda, Angola. I journey to these cities to learn how the leaders and residents are using the maps from the lasers and radars on the satellites to understand how to keep themselves safe from the floods, the tides, the storms. What surprised me most as I watched the Antarctic landscape rush by was the colors, especially as we started the journey back north toward Chile at sunset. The landscape of blues and greens and whites exploded with orange and purple and red, bouncing and scattering across rocks and ice. The destiny of Earthseed is to take root among the stars. It is to live and thrive on new Earths. It is to become new beings, to consider new questions, to leap into the heavens again and again. It is to explore the universe. It is to explore the vastness of ourselves. Octavia Butler. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter began its journey to image the moon in 2009. For years, it brought us photographs of the moon's surface, the rocks and hills and valleys and shadows and ice and soil. And the surprising story that these images tell us is the dance of the rocks that fly through space and land on the moon, leaving new craters on the surface and sending rocks and dirt hurtling across the landscape. This satellite showed us hundreds of new craters that have been formed since the beginning of its journey. And now the landscape of the moon is primarily shaped by this natural process of rocks arriving and creating a new view, a new landmark. And because there is no atmosphere, no wind on the moon, the arrival of each rock is permanently marked as a memorial to the physical connection of two celestial beings. For to survive in the mouth of this dragon we call America, we have to learn this first and most vital lesson, that we were never meant to survive, not as human beings, and that visibility which makes us most vulnerable is also the source of our greatest strength. Because the machine will try to grind you up into dust anyways, whether or not we speak. We can sit in our corners, mute forever, while our sisters and ourselves are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned. We can sit in our safe corners, mute as bottles, and we will still be no less afraid. Audre Lorde.
So thank you so much for this provocation. A lot of us trying to talk about the future, I think fail to live into the reality that the future is breaking in on us, and that future sites, future spaces of human habitation, human expansion is basically already present with us. In the same way that Elizabeth Alexander and Tracy K. Smith remind us that the past is present with us. And I wonder what a conversation like this means to people who examine embodiment in such profound ways as Dario and Kayla. I wonder what your responses are to notions about liberative conceptions of space. So yeah, I'd love to open it up and just hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke briefly a bit yesterday about this, and you know, for me, the question is, as a people, as the future is breaking in on us, right, as it approaches, unrelenting, right, and unstoppable, how do we reconcile the past, right? So as the future comes upon us, how do we reconcile the voids that exist within Black people, Black bodies, our stories? How do we prepare ourselves for a future that is, in many ways, and in some ways, beyond our control, right? That is outside of our own kind of state and corporate agency. And I think that, you know, speaking of state, you know, what Danielle spoke to so beautifully is the power of the divine feminine and the power of Black feminist thought in a way of reimagining or accessing a power that in space and time, that goes beyond space and time. A kind of power, a kind of agency that exists outside of space and time, and that's the only way to overcome that impendingness.
I think there's a processing, there's a processing where I feel like I don't know how separate right now the past is from the future. And I'm thinking about, I guess, it's like embodiment of freedom or liberation. I feel like it's this feeling of through, and there's this, like kind of to follow a dream, you have to allow your imagination to go there. But if you keep stopping at the door, or what always built that door, and so some of that embodiment is like, what are these feelings? What are these barriers? What are these things that are maybe personal? What are these historical things that already have these confines? And I guess like the liberation to me is the questioning of that, and I mean, even the physicality of pushing up against it, or writing about it, or finding your voice. There's like these other physical things in reality that I'm just wondering about how you can grasp onto this, like how you can process this bit to go there. I'm trying to remember the first thing you just said. That's what triggered that.
You know, I don't know, but as you speak, like I think that it's a matter of, like, you know, this pushing up against this thing, this structure, this design framework is like one understanding that this was designed, just like the terraforming, right? Like that this was terraformed, that everything around us is designed, right? The dress you're wearing, this chair I'm sitting on, was once a thought. And I had this conversation even earlier today, but you know, I define design as any technology to bring thought into space and time. And so when you think about design, when you think about the world as designed, then you have to ask, well, who designed it and what was the intention behind the design? But also when you realize that it was also just merely a thought, and so we are actually just existing in old thoughts. We're existing in old embodied ideas. We're existing in light that is moving so slowly that it appears to be solid, right? That it is all about relativity, right? Einstein talks about that as well. And so with that, then you realize that this thought or his thought is no more valid than your thought. And so it's the imagination, right?
And the terraform is kind of, if once you get to terraform, is that the power?
Well, that's it. That's the return, like, right? That is
Or destruction.
It's the. I mean, we're going off on some whole other shit, but it's like, but it is the returning to the individual of their agency, right? That just because something existed before you got here doesn't mean that it's more important or any more valid than any thought that you've ever had in your mind. And I think that we, as humans, are conditioned to think that things that exist, you know, and you spoke about it as well with Walt Disney World, because it was here before this, you arrived in this consciousness, it then goes unquestioned, when at one point it was designed and built, right?
If you don't mind, please go ahead.
I just got really excited. You're making connections and then take it away. Feeling, I'm just going to talk in fragments, it's going to make sense. Feeling from, so Audre Lorde, we're talking about grasping onto fullness of feeling. That feels like agency to me, this like divine, like maybe just divine feminine energy, but just something that's like a practice of suppression. And I guess sometimes with dance or embodiment, I have a hard time explaining what that means. If there's sometimes feels like there's this barrier about what is this person experiencing, but it's like the agency of feeling, the agency of having my own body, the agency of what I can do, what I'm capable of, and listening to wherever that feeling can go, which could just be these like physical movement, but it also could be action. It could be having this imagination of a different future. Got excited.
And in these same essays that we're referencing, Audre defines self-determination as the power to name oneself and to find one's own vision. I want to highlight the urgency of the moment, which is that currently the past is literally proposing to be the future, particularly with regard to how humans behave with terraforming. Meaning, we have momentum that's so powerful that the behavior we noticed with Disney having the right, even the encouragement, to literally take over a set of land and do with it as it pleased, with profit as the underlying motive, is continuing to repeat itself. And in my everyday life, I spend time with people who are excitedly planning the future of the moon, and many people are not around the discussion when it's happening, but people have money and technology and, in this sense, power to go forth and carry out their idea. They are ready to do so. So what excites me about being there and in the present is to ask, since I'm also there, and I'm also, I have feelings that I'm trying to transform into an action, how can my presence and the presence of community that sends me be hopefully breaking some of the inevitability of the past becoming the future? If we allow the colonialist and imperialist past to go forward, we will leave our children's children a moon that is exploited and denigrated. But how much more? It's not too late right now for us to offer a different option and leave them a beautiful monument to physics and to human connection.
So a lot of us, especially, we started this morning with, trying to sort of gasp a commemoration for Greg Tate. So, I mean, there's so much thisness, right? There's so much nowness. There's so much really weight here in the present. We're all here masked up for the second shape of things. It's a lot of almost a kind of existential drudgery to deal with past, present, to talk about. Can you help? I think it'd be interesting for us to try to think about technologies. I think all of you really. What kind of technologies are required for us to understand that our concerns for liberation, our concerns, all the concerns that we're laying out, even at this gathering, how do they extend into future in practical ways? For instance, what does the moon have to do with what we're trying to understand against the blood and brass of violence? what are some of the practical ways that we can see that unfortunate future, upon us? And then how can we get our mindset so that we're developing technologies and our different disciplines with that kind of cognizance?
My initial idea is just to think about the different spheres of life and how each one can be rejuvenated. And I have to pause and note that the one, technology that I'm drawing from, that I want to give full credit to, is that over this year I've been having conversation with Indigenous elders because they have experienced such an intensity of colonization and experience an ongoing reality that they have formulated, maybe you could call them technologies, approaches to rejecting colonization. So I've asked them for their advice on how they view these questions. And one example is the example of finding the balance and the connecting with the personality of both the human and the non-human, meaning connecting with our land, our water, our air, and our bodies all at the same time. Not to ignore all of them, because as they said, I'm just sharing ideas that we shared last week in the community, but if we need water to survive and air to survive, then we care for the air and it cares for us. So there are ways of thinking that we can draw from that become practices, and we hope they become embodied in our lives, our institutions. I think there are some healthy ways to rejuvenate particular forms of our life, whether it's our labor, whether it's our play, whether it's our food. Maybe we can start by asking how to reclaim particular spheres of life. But what do you all think of that?
I don't know. I mean, ultimately, I kind of feel that this is going to sound quite nihilistic, but I think in a way it's quite futile, because I'm not sure we're actually asking the right questions, and I think it's never really about the answer, but it's about getting to the right question, and this question about the moon and the future and all of these, suppose that somehow we have the power to save Earth, or we somehow have the power to save the moon, as if we did not come from these things, right? Like apples come out of trees, and so these are the apples talking about how do we save the tree, and it's like, no, the tree's going to be fine. We're talking about us. We're talking about, will we survive? How will we live? That's what we're getting at. We're not talking about the Earth. We don't need to save the Earth. The Earth is going to be fine. It was fine without us, and it'll be fine without us again. And so then I think it comes down to the individual, right? And I think when you speak about feeling, I think it's about getting in touch with that, right? Like your feelings as your own guidance system, right? Your own guidance system to help you navigate your own life, right? And I think ultimately it's about just you following your desire, you following that inner voice, you being quiet enough, being quiet enough to actually hear what is trying to come through you, what is calling forth. Perhaps there's a future consciousness that will manifest as a child or a grandchild that's actually calling you to take that trip to Japan to meet the person that you're going to marry, to bring them forth. And that's it, right? Because there was nothing that I could have done 200 years ago to stop the internet from arriving, right? And so what am I going to do now to stop whatever's going to be 200 years from now from happening, right? And I think that there is I think there's a hubris involved in a lot of these questions. When I think our job, the thing that one can do within themselves is to just get closer to being themselves.
But I have to disagree with you a little bit on the physics side, meaning right now, humans, not to bring something that's just a different point of view on the question of whether the Earth's going to be fine, because right now humans are changing physical aspects of the Earth so fast, but humans also experience, I'll say one set of humans is changing and another set of humans is bearing these implications. So even in the very, very short term, like the next 5 years, the process of humans creating, in this case, such a large amount of greenhouse gases, it means that kids in certain coastal cities, get diarrhea at increased rates and die, and they don't have to be, right? Like that's
no.
That's today.
I don't think that's a disagreement. I think that's a nuance.
Yeah, but that's just where
right? Do you know what I mean?
Us changing the earth, like the earth is not suffering, but the earth is then sending its just consequences back to us. Like, look, you heated up the earth. Congratulations, now you have kids getting flooded and getting diarrhea and passing away.
No,
right?
no. It's a double tapping on that, right? Which is one. Are we here to save the earth? That's one. And the second point that you're bringing up is, what are we doing that has immediate effects on the lives that other people's lives, right? And I think those are two things. One is maybe much broader, right, in scope. And you're also at NASA, right? And so, when you're thinking about planets, when you're thinking about galaxies, when you're thinking about star clusters, like it changes the scale. It changes the scale of what I do with this paper bag right now. But yes, also, what are we doing and what are we sacrificing and who's being affected by those everyday choices that we make? Because we have been conditioned and we've grown up in a culture that that forces our hand to destruction, right? Right. I have a cell phone in my pocket. There's a couple of people who suffered for me to have this. Do you know what I mean? And that's one level, right? And you spoke about multiple scales. You spoke about multiple spheres, right? What violence am I doing speaking even the English language, right? Because that also is a design technology. That also is something that was constructed for a very specific purpose. And that also shapes my reality and the schema and the way in which I view myself in relation to the other, or the ways in which the English language forces me to other, right? Not all languages operate that way. And so there are lots of questions here, but yes, also, what is the sanctity of a human life, right? What is the sanctity of a human life, and how, as we think about the future, as we think about what's happening, on the moon, how will that have deleterious effects to us on Earth? How will that change? I mean, I don't know, you can maybe speak to this, like, can it change, wave patterns and the ways in which tides, right, are formed or flow, I don't know the right word for it, but do you know what I mean? When we've decided to make the moon a Disneyland. And that's something that I thought about a lot when you were speaking as well. Like, are we just here to play? Is that it?
Yeah, I guess I'm just it's Pandora's box. I'm like, are we? I'm like, is this talking about survival? Which I feel like this is the black question. Is it survival, or is there yeah, are we talking about survival, or are we talking about possibility? And yeah, it feels like the more that you push forward or try this idea, the more that I feel like the resistance of what already is. That's the
resistance
feeling
of
it.
what already is.
Yeah, and I guess what's the technologies then, I guess, or is it like these real technologies that, I was like, I feel like I got technologies, I feel equipped, but I'm not sure how that goes to the moon. This is like the imagining luxury, imagining farther.
I think it does bring us to the scale thing, and I think it's really interesting to talk to, rocket scientist, a dancer, and a polymath who also deals in image making and thinking with brands about embodiment and imaging and lining up ideas that will literally shape how people see bodies and themselves for periods of time. But so that's this subjective thing, and I'm wondering about scale. Is there a way to talk across disciplines? Because that's really what's urgent at this gathering called Shape of Things, in the context of a land of broken dreams. But is there a way to talk across disciplines, not about survival, but about life, about what is surviving? And so is there a way to talk across disciplines about LIFE, to do the Greg Tate thing? I mean, life. Is there a way to talk across disciplines about that?
And the answer is LOVE, right?
Okay.
It ultimately boils down to that, right? How do we love? How do we create space for love? How do we allow people access to themselves to actually love themselves? Because so many decisions that are being made in places of power because people do not love themselves. They don't even want to be here. They don't want to be alive, right? And those in places of power, right? And we, in this country, we sometimes call them white people or white privilege. They're trapped too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Paulo Freire, in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he says the act of liberation, it's not about the transference of power. It's not about transferring power from the oppressor to the oppressed, but about a restoration of humanity. Because by restoring humanity to those from which it was taken, you also restore humanity to those who lost it in the taking. And so what we have to have a conversation about is what being on the other side of power, what is actually lost there, right? And I think that powers that be are telling themselves a story, or have told themselves a story, that this is not an even exchange. And it is. And so I think it comes down to like love, right? Like that you love the air and you love what the air does for you. You love the water and what the water does for you. And the poet and scholar Alexis Pauline Gumbs talks about, you know, institutions that are not rooted in love, because what love will cause you to do is reckon with yourself, right? Love is not an easy act. To be loved will call from you a version of yourself that you may not be ready to deal with. And so that is it, right?
That's good. I have one more question to pose to Dr. Will, just following up about the idea of terraforming. And we've talked about anti-colonial views of space. We're all thinking about systems that are alternate systems that we can try to establish, kind of get going. Is that a reality? Is that something realistic that we should be actually thinking about? Is there a positivized kind of technology that is like terraforming that would actually guide us to a different outcome? Because obviously we are living right now colonialist project outcomes. It's just like there is the checklist, the sticky notes. We're living it. So, is there a way to terraform in a positive way? Meaning, are there grand technologies, large-scale technologies that we can even start to collaborate across disciplines? And then I'd love to just open it up to all the folks that are here in the room to offer their responses also.
One experiment that I'm trying is asking people to be reformed within their different disciplines, and then to look for what that discipline could do in its renewed or redeemed state. So I teach students coming from architecture, engineering, science, and art. We read Audre Lorde for hours. We check in with Angela, we check in with Paulo, and we say, how have our own fields created this checklist of colonial racial capitalism? We grieve that. That takes months, actually. After that, I ask, what if you tried to do a design rooted in architecture or dance or photography? And what if that design process tried to apply some of the principles we've seen from the queer Black feminists we've been reading, the indigenous thinkers we've been reading? Let's try small at first. Usually we start small at first, but then we can imagine scaling it. So we're spending time trying to say, what if we were trying to design a queer space that was actually life-giving? What does it mean to make public spaces that are safe, truly safe for everyone? We're trying this out. We don't have all the results yet. I hope some of you can come and help us with our experiment. We think this might be a process where if we check at every stage of the traditional design process of a given field, architecture, engineering, photography, dance, and we say, some of the questions you were highlighting, if we say, what if they were rooted in love? What if they were rooted in accepting different gender identities, different ways of being? What if they actually could be redeemed? Would the new outcomes be healthy? I have some hope, although I don't think it's perfect, but I do think there's ways to consciously redeem some of these practices.
Thank you. Yeah. Any questions from the group in the room for anyone on any other panelists or responses? Yeah.
I was just going to add on to that. So in teaching dance, which I always hesitate around everyone else. I'm like, does dance mean anything to you? But in teaching dance or teaching rather people how to find their voice or this feeling or this agency or their identity, I try to offer, it's in a way this like reformation of like, so we get all these tools, like we get these forms, and this could mean this, and this could be jazz, and this could be this, and it might come from here, it comes from all these other voices, and then when, you know, you ask someone to be themselves, it's interesting that you know, that could be, I recently just asked, you know, 18, 19-year-olds, and they said, I have no idea what that is, no one asked me that. And so it's just almost, you know, this unfamiliar place, and then you even talking about like reforming, like I did a solo on power, or I just wanted to feel myself at my fullest capacity. So I just have these like, I have these feelings, and I'm able to see myself, but I don't feel like maybe I'm allowed to feel that in these spaces, or I'm allowed to be that, or I'm not seen in that way. So then I use whatever form to me, which might be dance, writing, photography, in order to create that or see that feeling. And at first it was like, power was like, it was force, and it was, you know, a reflection of all the violence and all the things that I've seen, and like how I could feel it too. I could feel like a white man. And it's like, I've seen it, I can do it. And then as it kept going, I was like, I don't know if that's really power. Like it was like, is it the ability, I got tired, is it the ability to be able to keep going? Is it the motor? Is it the ability to feel? Is it the ability to like love anyway, and not in spite of, but anyway? It turned into more of these questions about what am I actually talking about, and who am I in this? And then what you're talking about with the camera, I was just so happy to have something that I could reflect back, and I was like, I want to see myself, like if someone else can't see me. And that was such an empowering, it was so empowering to be able to hold that perspective, and also to be able to flip that and see us, or tell our stories, or record, and it's like you do with radio, but literally recording other stories and talking, and as there's just more power than I thought, or maybe that we think that we have, in that identity, in reclaiming these local spaces maybe, and changing those thoughts.
Yeah, and that essentially power is not in control, but power is in surrender, right? Because you get tired trying to make it happen, right? Instead of just like allowing and knowing that wherever you are, wherever we are, you're constantly being held, right? And we've been conditioned to believe that somehow we're not. But we're all suspended right now, suspended, held, couched in like love and care and air and stardust and do you know what I mean? There's no way we couldn't be. Like, it would actually defy the laws of physics, right? Even like the law of the conservation of energy, right? That matter cannot be created nor destroyed, right? Which means that your very existence, you are here because there was a void. There would be no space for you if there was not space made. And so everyone is here for a reason, right? Like, you are here to take up space because there was a void. So yeah, let's open it up though if somebody wants to say something. Or comment, or question.
You know, as a thought experiment, the question had come up before. You know, what do some of the things that we're trying to work for now look like in space? And I keep coming back to this. Isn't that an important question? Because basically in my lifetime, I'm going to have to deal with the reality that they're already doing systemic racism in space, where they're already doing these dynamics that I've been, you know, railing against, riding against. That's already basically happening in a site that I have yet to make my way into with in terms of access or imagination even, right? So I'm trying to ascertain in what ways I'm slovenly in my attentions. But is there practice, is there value in saying, okay, here are new sites of human expansion, relevant to our children and grandchildren, relevant to elementary school students. This past week, there are apparently some interviews. One of them was yours for astronauts. So this is an astronaut who you're not going, but you were right there sitting next to someone who is going. So it's not an obscurity, is what I'm trying to get at. And what does it mean to practice thinking about some of our concerns? I love the limitation of dance. It's a very helpful limitation because you've got to deal with it in the body. it's the choreographers hold it down in terms of actually talking about limitations. And so it's a great practice to try to be in spaces that we really can't be in daily life. You're going to do things that take me to places I can't be in daily life. So similarly, I wonder, thinking about future habitation, future sites, what would this liberation we're desiring look like in a context as near as the moon or as near as we see as Mars?
Before we get there, I want to provoke that. What would happen if you took that space in your mind about thinking about what's going to happen on the moon and actually removed it and created space for something else that had an immediate effect, like today or like maybe next week?
So this is the beautiful thing. So it's not either or. So everything I do with my work and my students, we're constantly making a circle and we're asking, if I ask a question like this, what if when we live together on the moon, there's zero waste? What if we don't create any waste? Every bit of matter, air, any solid materials, any food is valuable, which it would be because you would know that I need this for something else. What if we took that same concept on Earth? I posit that if we were able to live in a way that actually eliminated waste on Earth, it would mean everyone would be also experiencing a life without wealth inequality and without exploitation. Because when you eliminate waste, it means from a human perspective and from a physical perspective, you're taking the best possible benefit of everyone and everything, and they're thriving instead of being lost. So the question of how do I live in space, literally how to design so that I can use every bit of water, which I'm desperately holding on to in space, drives me right back to ask, what if we applied the same questions for Earth? This is my daily practice. We have technologies that were often invented maybe for an astronaut, but it's usually a good idea that if you actually used it on Earth, it would make things better on Earth as well. But we have to do it, we have to consciously ask the question and then bring the idea back to Earth every day.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, the provocation was really more in, I think a lot of times I think as a culture, we are constant, and particularly like as Black and brown people, like we're forced to stay in this state of reactivity, and will there be like space for us there, right? Like because we have to navigate, right? We had to have a green book in order to travel, to see if we could stay, right? So there was always a planning ahead that we've had to do always, right? And so that's here, right? That just is. And, and there's always gonna be a new COVID variant, and there's always gonna be Lindsay Lohan coming back to acting. There's always gonna be something to keep us reacting, right? And in the state of like distraction. And rarely does it have anything to do with the next 20 things we need to do in order to make our dream come true. Rarely does it have anything to do with like the next 20 things I have to do. And so, I'm wondering what does it mean to acknowledge, right? Think about, and then also put it in its proper place, that it doesn't take up so much mental space, because all we have is our attention at the end of the day. That is the most valuable resource, right? And I think that we as a species have yet to understand the power of attention and focus in the shaping of our own lived experience. From this point of view, from the I, the thing that we call the I, and how that shapes our reality. And I think that focus and attention is the same technology that our ancestors used in order to shift and shape a future that did not look like anything they were in at the time. right? And I don't think that it came from a place of, I can't speak for it, right? Necessarily worry, but definitely a space of like dreaming and imagination. But we only have so much bandwidth, right? We only have so much attention, and so what does that mean for us? While we consider, right? Because we do have to be in the lab, right? There is data that we have to get to, right? Like, you know, Toni Morrison speaks about it, you know, in her essay. I'm not even going to attempt to remember which one out of the many. But, you know, she talks about like the progression of knowledge, right? That it goes from data to information to knowledge to wisdom, right? And so we have to be there. You have to be there in those spaces, right? Someone has to voice, right? Someone has to renew the discipline.
I'm just thinking about the example, as I read briefly from Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. So here she presents this really nightmare version of Southern California, which could happen like in a few hours. It could happen anytime. It's in some parts you see it. You see the period in which, you know, people are not physically safe. There's no access to water. I guess never mind, it's happening now. But only to say that in the midst of this, you have this amazing woman, LeRonn, who is a superhero, but I don't want to use it in the sense of something distant. She's a woman who's, you know, working through survival. She manages to be simultaneously creating this religion, presenting the future of moving humanity to the stars to survive and to thrive. She manages to do that while also walking on the roads, literally, of kind of navigating danger and creating a community. So her way of taking the future vision and applying it to right now is to love other humans, protect them, build enough communities so that they can survive, and then let that be a seed of what she envisions as a distant future. Of course, it's fiction, but I think Octavia's giving us a recipe which has some pieces we can draw from. So it's maintaining the vision, it's maintaining community, it's fighting like the very next battle, in this case for water, for safety, I think, but never losing sight of the vision of the future. It's somewhere in there. It's something we can draw from.
We do have to wrap. I thank you so much. I think I want to leave it with the dancer. Would you give us just some movement? And so we'll end with no words. But would you just give us some movement and we'll finish?
You said no words, but I'm going to just say, I'm just going to say three phrases.
No words.
I feel like fantasy, something about the fantastical fantasy that bats against survival. It sounds like they shouldn't go together, but for some reason they do. Vision and what is your power?
So I want to thank Dario and Kayla and Danielle Wood. You can follow them follow their work and check out their work. instituteofblackimagination.com, blackimagination.com. Kayla, where can they find your work? KaylaFarrish.com? Yeah. Or go to Sleep No More and after this now. And of course, Space Enabled at MIT Media Lab. And I thank you for being here at this time.